He was known in his community as dependable and easy to trust, a familiar presence who rarely drew attention. It was only after a quiet investigation began that authorities uncovered a case that would unsettle the entire neighborhood and force people to reconsider how well they truly knew those around them. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters. Tonight, we explore for unsettling stories where appearances concealed something far darker. Take a moment to settle in. Breathe slowly. Let the outside world fade. This is the story of Samuel Cooper, later known to investigators as the Carpenter of Carnage. Let's begin. Before smartphones captured every moment, before doorbell cameras watched our thresholds, there existed pockets of darkness where predators moved freely among us, wearing the mask of normalcy so convincingly that neighbors waved, clients welcomed them into homes, and victims never saw the transformation coming. Samuel Cooper understood this advantage better than most. For years, he walked through unlocked doors, accepted cups of coffee from unsuspecting hands, and studied the layouts of houses while discussing repair estimates. But Cooper wasn't memorizing where the water heater sat or which floorboards creaked. He was mapping escape routes, identifying soundproofing opportunities, and selecting his next target. This is the account of how an ordinary tradesman became one of the most ruthless killers in modern history, and how the bodies kept accumulating while an entire town remained oblivious to the monster living in plain sight. If you enjoy listening and would like to find this channel again, you're welcome to subscribe. Samuel Cooper arrived in the rural stretches of northern Michigan during the autumn of 1989, driving a rust-spotted pickup truck loaded with construction equipment and carpenter's tools. The town of Rosewood Creek needed skilled laborers, the kind who could patch roofs, install cabinetry, and restore century-old farmhouses without charging city prices. Cooper fit that description perfectly. He secured a modest rental property on the outskirts of town, established himself at the local hardware store as a regular customer, and began accepting odd jobs throughout the county. Those who hired him during those initial months remembered a quiet man, perhaps 40 years of age, with calloused hands and an unremarkable face that blended into any crowd. He didn't drink at the tavern or attend church socials. He arrived punctually for contracted work, completed tasks with meticulous precision, and departed without lingering for unnecessary conversation. This reserved demeanor struck most residents as nothing more than the temperament of a solitary craftsman, someone who preferred sawdust and silence to small-town gossip. But beneath this carefully constructed facade existed something far more sinister. Cooper's basement, which he immediately renovated upon moving into the rental house, concealed modifications that would have alarmed any inspector. Soundproofing foam-lined walls that he'd reinforced with additional concrete blocks. Heavy-duty locks secured doors that he'd replaced with steel core alternatives. Ventilation systems hummed quietly, circulating air through spaces designed for purposes that had nothing to do with carpentry or storage. His first victim vanished during the winter of 1990. Margaret Holloway, a 63-year-old widow, had hired Cooper to repair water damage in her kitchen ceiling. She lived alone on a property surrounded by dense pine forest, the nearest neighbor situated over a mile away down a gravel road that became impassable during heavy snowfall. Cooper had visited her home 3 times for preliminary assessments, noting during each visit how isolated she remained, how infrequently her telephone rang, how few visitors appeared at her door. On the afternoon of January 14th, Cooper arrived as scheduled to begin the ceiling repairs. Margaret welcomed him inside, offering hot coffee and homemade cookies while discussing the scope of the project. She never noticed when he locked the front door behind him or when his expression shifted from professional courtesy to something cold and calculating. The attack happened with brutal efficiency, Cooper's hands closing around her throat before she could comprehend the sudden transformation, her struggles weakening as oxygen deprivation took effect, her final moments spent staring into eyes that held no mercy, no hesitation, no humanity. Cooper worked methodically after Margaret's body went limp. He wrapped her remains in industrial plastic sheeting that he'd brought in his tool bags, loaded everything into his truck under the cover of early winter darkness, and transported his victim to the basement he'd prepared. There, he dismembered the body using the same saws and cutting implements that he employed for legitimate carpentry work. The pieces went into heavy-duty contractor bags, which he buried in different locations throughout the vast stretches of state forest surrounding Rosewood Creek. Margaret's disappearance troubled the community but didn't immediately trigger suspicions of foul play. She had mentioned to neighbors her intention to visit relatives downstate, and her age combined with the harsh winter conditions created plausible scenarios for delayed returns or extended stays. When spring arrived without her reappearance, concern grew into alarm, but by then the trail had gone completely cold. Investigators found her home locked and undisturbed, with no signs of struggle, no evidence of forced entry, no indication that violence had occurred within those walls. Cooper continued accepting jobs throughout the region, his reputation as a reliable handyman growing steadily. He demonstrated remarkable patience, allowing months to pass between selecting targets and acting on those selections. This restraint served him well, preventing the establishment of patterns that might attract law enforcement attention. His second victim, Thomas Garrett, disappeared in late summer of 1990 under circumstances that mirrored Margaret's vanishing. A solitary individual living in rural isolation, hiring Cooper for home repairs, and then simply ceasing to exist. Thomas, a 57-year-old bachelor who operated a small tree-cutting service, had employed Cooper to construct a storage shed on his property. The two men worked together over several weekends, with Cooper learning Thomas's routines, understanding his lack of close family connections, recognizing the opportunity that isolation presented. The final weekend came in September, when Cooper arrived with tools and materials ostensibly for completing the shed's roofing. But instead of construction supplies, his truck bed concealed the implements of murder rope, plastic sheeting, and the pharmaceutical sedatives he'd begun acquiring through forged prescriptions. Cooper offered Thomas a beer during their lunch break, the beverage already contaminated with dissolved sedatives. Within 20 minutes, Thomas exhibited confusion and impaired coordination. Within an hour, he'd collapsed into unconsciousness. Cooper dragged his victim into the partially completed shed, bound him with rope, and waited for the sedatives to wear off enough for Thomas to regain minimal awareness. What followed over the next several hours demonstrated the depths of Cooper's sadism. Prolonged suffocation interrupted by resuscitation, repeated blunt force trauma to non-vital areas, and psychological torment as Thomas realized his fate while remaining too drugged and restrained to resist effectively. The killing concluded with manual strangulation, Cooper's hands once again proving to be his preferred method of ending life. He dismembered Thomas's body in the shed itself, cleaning the space afterward with industrial solvents and bleach solutions. The body parts received burial in remote forest locations, spread across such vast distances that discovering one location would provide no leads toward finding others. Thomas's truck received new plates and a fresh paint job before Cooper drove it to a town 3 counties away, abandoning it in a shopping center parking lot, where it would eventually be towed and processed through bureaucratic channels that led nowhere. Throughout 1991 and 1992, Cooper's body count increased with terrifying consistency. He killed 7 more individuals during this period. Men and women ranging in age from their 30s to their 70s, all sharing common characteristics that made them vulnerable to his predation. They lived alone. They occupied remote properties. They hired Cooper for home repair projects that required multiple visits and provided him with detailed knowledge of their daily patterns. And they trusted him, that trust proving fatal when Cooper decided the moment had arrived to transform from helpful handyman into merciless killer. Each murder demonstrated Cooper's evolving methodology. He experimented with different approaches to incapacitation, blunt force trauma, drug-induced sedation, surprise attacks from behind, settling eventually on combinations that maximized his control while minimizing risks of escape or defensive wounds that might raise questions if bodies were ever discovered. His basement workshop became a slaughterhouse where victims experienced their final terrifying hours, where soundproofing prevented screams from reaching beyond those concrete walls, where Cooper indulged increasingly sadistic impulses without fear of interruption or discovery. The disposal of remains became almost ritualistic in its precision. Cooper maintained detailed mental maps of burial locations, ensuring sufficient distance between sites while avoiding areas with high foot traffic or potential development. He varied his patterns, sometimes burying complete bodies, other times scattering dismembered parts across multiple locations. Dental records meant nothing when skulls were crushed beyond recognition. Fingerprints provided no identification when hands were severed and buried separately from torsos. Cooper understood that without bodies, families received no closure, investigators possessed no crime scenes, and he remained free to continue hunting. By 1993, Samuel Cooper had refined his predatory craft to disturbing levels of efficiency. He'd murdered at least 15 individuals, though the exact count remained uncertain even to him. Some kills blurred together in his memory, their details merging into a singular narrative of violence and death. The initial caution that characterized his early murders had given way to increasing confidence, even arrogance. He began targeting victims in adjacent counties, expanding his hunting grounds while maintaining the appearance of a legitimate tradesman simply accepting work wherever opportunities arose. His 16th victim introduced new elements of cruelty that would define his subsequent crimes. Jennifer Walsh, a 34-year-old elementary school teacher, had recently purchased a foreclosed farmhouse that required extensive renovations. She'd hired Cooper after receiving his name from the hardware store owner, who considered the handyman reliable and affordable. Jennifer's isolated property, situated at the end of a 2-mile dirt road, presented Cooper with ideal conditions for prolonged torture, something he'd been craving with increasing intensity. Cooper spent 3 weeks working on legitimate repairs while studying Jennifer's schedule, learning when she arrived home from school, understanding that her nearest neighbor lived too far away to hear anything unusual, noting that she rarely received visitors during weekdays. On a Thursday afternoon in March, he arrived unscheduled, claiming he'd forgotten a specialized tool during his previous visit. Jennifer welcomed him inside without hesitation, that trust sealing her fate. The attack came as she turned to retrieve her purse for payment arrangements, Cooper's arms snaking around her neck in a chokehold that rendered her unconscious within seconds. He'd perfected this technique over dozens of victims, understanding precisely how much pressure to apply, exactly how long to maintain constriction to achieve unconsciousness without causing immediate death. Jennifer woke hours later in Cooper's basement, restrained to a reinforced metal table he'd constructed specifically for this purpose. Her mouth gagged, her limbs immobilized, her eyes wide with terror as comprehension dawned. What Jennifer endured over the next 48 hours exceeded the boundaries of human endurance. Cooper inflicted systematic torture, cutting implements that carved shallow wounds across her flesh, pliers that extracted fingernails and toenails with agonizing slowness, burns from heated tools that left permanent scarring on skin he would eventually bury in unmarked graves. He kept her conscious through most of this torment, using smelling salts to revive her whenever shock or pain threatened to grant the mercy of unconsciousness. Her muffled screams echoed uselessly against soundproofed walls while Cooper documented her suffering in handwritten journals. Detailed accounts of each injury, descriptions of her reactions, clinical observations about human pain thresholds and breaking points. Jennifer's death came not from any single catastrophic injury but from accumulated trauma, blood loss, infection beginning in untreated wounds, shock overwhelming her system until vital organs simply surrendered. Cooper watched her die over the course of hours, noting the precise moment when awareness faded from her eyes, when breathing became irregular gasps, when life itself abandoned a body that had suffered beyond its capacity to continue. He felt no remorse, no disgust at what he'd inflicted, only satisfaction that his experiments had yielded useful data about human suffering and the surprisingly resilient nature of victims who desperately wanted to survive. Jennifer's disappearance generated more attention than Cooper's previous victims had received. She worked at a school where her absence was immediately noticed. She had family members who called daily, friends who grew concerned when texts and phone calls went unanswered, colleagues who understood that Jennifer would never simply abandon her students mid-semester. Law enforcement launched an investigation within 72 hours of her last confirmed sighting, interviewing neighbors, examining her property, and speaking with anyone who'd had recent contact with the missing teacher. Cooper's name emerged during these interviews, The hardware store owner mentioned him as someone Jennifer had hired. Neighbors recalled seeing his truck at her property on multiple occasions, and receipts found in Jennifer's home office confirmed she'd paid him for renovation work. Investigators interviewed Cooper, finding him cooperative and apparently concerned about Jennifer's welfare. He explained his work at the property, provided dates and descriptions of repairs he'd completed, expressed surprise at her disappearance, and suggested that perhaps she'd encountered problems with previous owners or upset someone in her personal life. His calm demeanor, detailed responses, and lack of suspicious behavior satisfied investigators, who moved on to other potential leads while Jennifer's remains decomposed in shallow graves scattered across 3 different counties. The increased scrutiny should have prompted Cooper to pause his activities, to lie low until attention shifted elsewhere. Instead, it seemed to energize him. Within 6 weeks of killing Jennifer, he'd murdered 2 more victims, both following similar patterns of isolated individuals hiring him for home repairs, both enduring prolonged torture in his basement workshop, both meeting their ends through various combinations of violence that Cooper choreographed with the precision of a conductor leading a symphony of suffering. During this period, Cooper began taking trophies, small items belonging to victims that he stored in a locked chest hidden behind false walls in his basement. Jewelry, identification cards, personal photographs, articles of clothing. These mementos held no material value but represented something Cooper treasured far more than money. They were proof of his power, tangible evidence of lives he'd extinguished, reminders of moments when he'd held complete dominion over another human being's existence. Late at night, he would retrieve this chest, examining each item while reliving the associated murder, his memory supplying vivid details of screams, pleas, and the gradual dimming of hope in eyes that realized no rescue would arrive. His 19th victim, Michael Patterson, represented Cooper's boldest move yet. Michael wasn't elderly, isolated by geography, or living alone. He was a 42-year-old contractor with a wife and 3 children, residing in a suburban development where homes sat close together and neighborhood watch programs encouraged vigilance. But Michael had hired Cooper for a basement finishing project, work that required multiple weeks of regular visits, and Cooper had noticed something that presented an opportunity. Michael's wife worked night shifts as a nurse, leaving him alone with the sleeping children several evenings per week. Cooper chose a Tuesday in late autumn, arriving after dark under the pretense of working on electrical installations that he claimed were best completed when household power demands were minimal. Michael let him in, checked on his sleeping children, and returned to find Cooper holding a framing hammer in one hand and wearing an expression that transformed his entire countenance from friendly tradesman to predatory nightmare. The assault happened before Michael could shout a warning to his children, Cooper bringing the hammer down against his skull with practiced force, calculated to incapacitate without causing immediate death. Michael regained consciousness in Cooper's basement, the transition from his suburban home to this torture chamber having occurred while he remained unconscious in the back of Cooper's truck. The realization that his children had been left alone, that his wife would return to find him missing, that his family would suffer not knowing his fate. These thoughts tortured Michael as effectively as any physical implement Cooper would employ over the coming hours. Cooper used this psychological anguish deliberately, describing in graphic detail how Michael's children might cope with losing their father, speculating about whether his wife would remarry, questioning whether anyone would even remember Michael's existence 5 years hence. The physical torture that accompanied these psychological attacks demonstrated Cooper's expanding repertoire of violence. He employed power tools, drills that created wounds through non-vital tissue, sanders that abraded skin down to muscle and bone, saws that removed digits with surgical precision. Michael's screams, even muffled by industrial-grade soundproofing, achieved volumes that would have summoned help in any normal circumstances. But Cooper's basement existed as a void separate from society's protections, a space where violence unfolded without consequence, where suffering lasted as long as Cooper desired, where death arrived only when he granted that final mercy. Michael died after approximately 18 hours of continuous torture, his body succumbing to shock and blood loss despite Cooper's efforts to prolong the experience. Cooper had wanted to extend Michael's suffering longer, to push boundaries even further, but biology imposed limitations that even his sadistic creativity couldn't overcome. Still, he considered the experiment largely successful, the data valuable for future reference. Michael's body received the standard disposal treatment. Dismemberment, dissolution of tissue in chemical baths. Cooper had developed burial of remaining bones in remote forest locations where discovery seemed improbable. Michael's disappearance created immediate and intense scrutiny. His wife returned from her shift to find the house disturbed. Tools and materials from the basement project scattered in disarray. Signs of struggle evident in displaced furniture and blood traces that Cooper hadn't completely cleaned during his hasty abduction. Law enforcement treated this as an active crime scene, processing evidence, interviewing neighbors, and constructing timelines that quickly identified Cooper as the last person confirmed to have contact with the missing man. Detective Sarah Richmond had investigated missing persons cases for 12 years, but the Michael Patterson disappearance troubled her in ways that previous cases hadn't. The evidence suggested abduction. Blood at the scene, signs of struggle, the victim's truck remaining in the driveway, but what motivated such brazen violence remained unclear. Robbery seemed unlikely given that valuables and cash remained untouched in the Patterson home. Random violence didn't fit either, as whoever attacked Michael had specifically targeted him during a narrow window when his wife worked and children slept. The contractor angle drew Richmond's attention immediately. She compiled lists of everyone who'd worked on the Patterson property during the previous 6 months, cross-referencing those names against her department's database of previous investigations. Samuel Cooper's name appeared not once but 7 times, connected to missing persons cases dating back 5 years, always as a peripheral figure who'd performed work for victims shortly before their disappearances. Individually, these connections meant nothing. Collectively, they formed a pattern that Richmond couldn't ignore. She requested records from neighboring counties, expanding her search parameters to include any missing persons reports where Cooper's name appeared in case files, witness statements, or background investigations. The results shocked her. Cooper had worked for at least 23 individuals who'd subsequently vanished without trace. The cases spanning 6 counties and dating back to his arrival in the region during 1989. Some victims had been elderly, others middle-aged, a few relatively young. But they shared common characteristics: rural properties, solitary lifestyles, minimal family connections, and the misfortune of hiring Samuel Cooper for home repairs. Richmond presented her findings to the county prosecutor, requesting authorization for surveillance and expanded investigation into Cooper's background and activities. The prosecutor, mindful of civil liberties and the circumstantial nature of the evidence, approved limited surveillance while Richmond pursued additional leads. She began with Cooper's past, discovering that he'd lived in 3 other states before arriving in Michigan, and that each location showed clusters of unsolved missing persons cases during periods corresponding to his residence there. The pattern became undeniable. Cooper wasn't simply an unlucky handyman whose clients happened to disappear. He was a serial predator who used his trade as camouflage for identifying and accessing victims. Richmond estimated conservatively that Cooper had murdered at least 40 people over the past 15 years, possibly many more if unsolved cases from his earlier years could be attributed to him. The scope of his crimes exceeded anything Richmond had encountered in her career, rivaling infamous serial killers whose names dominated true crime literature and FBI databases. Meanwhile, Cooper sensed the increased attention. Surveillance teams attempted discretion, but Cooper's paranoia had sharpened over years of evading detection. He noticed vehicles that appeared too frequently in his mirrors, recognized faces that seemed to watch him during errands, felt the weight of law enforcement scrutiny, even when investigators believed themselves unobserved. This awareness should have triggered flight. Cooper possessed cash reserves, multiple false identities prepared for emergencies, and sufficient head start to disappear into another state before authorities could organize a coordinated response. But Cooper didn't run. Instead, he accelerated his timeline, driven by compulsions that overwhelmed even his instinct for self-preservation. He'd already selected his next victim, Rebecca Morrison, a 31-year-old freelance writer living alone on a converted farmstead that she'd purchased specifically for its isolation. She'd hired Cooper to install security systems, an irony that Cooper appreciated with dark humor. He would be the last person Rebecca saw before death claimed her. The man she trusted to make her home safer would instead transform it into her final prison. Cooper arrived at Rebecca's property on a gray November afternoon, his truck loaded with equipment that included both legitimate security system components and the tools of torture he'd perfected over dozens of murders. Rebecca greeted him warmly, discussing installation plans while offering coffee that Cooper accepted but never drank. Maintaining complete sobriety had become ritual before his murders, a discipline he refused to compromise even when anxiety about surveillance gnawed at his concentration. The attack came swiftly once Cooper confirmed they were alone. Rebecca collapsed under the impact of his surprise assault, consciousness fleeing as Cooper's chokehold cut oxygen to her brain. He secured her with zip ties, gagged her with industrial tape, and loaded her into the back of his truck beneath canvas tarps that concealed her immobile form. The drive to his basement took 20 minutes, Cooper checking his mirrors constantly for signs of surveillance vehicles, finding nothing that suggested immediate pursuit. Rebecca woke in hell. The basement's soundproofed walls mocked her attempts at screaming. The restraints bit into flesh whenever she struggled. The surgical lights Cooper positioned overhead blazed with intensity that made her eyes water and rendered her captor's face a shadowy blur whenever he leaned into her field of vision. Cooper spoke calmly as he worked, explaining procedures with clinical detachment, describing injuries he intended to inflict, speculating about how long Rebecca might survive before shock or blood loss or simple accumulation of trauma shut down her vital systems. What followed over the next 36 hours represented Cooper at his most sadistic. He employed every technique he'd developed across decades of torture and murder: cutting, burning, crushing, tearing. He broke bones with methodical precision, starting with fingers and toes before progressing to larger structures. He used acid to create chemical burns that penetrated deep into tissue, the wounds resistant to healing and guaranteed to cause extended agony. He inflicted sexual violence that left Rebecca traumatized beyond her physical injuries, psychological wounds that would have required years of therapy to heal if she'd survived to receive such treatment. But Rebecca wouldn't survive. Cooper knew this with certainty, had known it from the moment he selected her as his target. She would die in his basement, her screams unheard beyond these walls, her suffering witnessed only by the man who inflicted it, her death providing Cooper with satisfaction that he craved more desperately than food or sleep or human connection. He watched her fade over hours, tracking the progression from desperate resistance to exhausted acceptance, noting the precise moment when she stopped begging for mercy and simply waited for death's arrival. Rebecca died as dawn broke on the second day of her captivity, her body surrendering to accumulated trauma, vital signs fading despite Cooper's attempts to prolong her suffering through chemical stimulants and crude emergency medicine. He felt frustrated that his experiments had concluded sooner than desired, but the approaching daylight required him to begin disposal procedures. He worked through the morning, dismembering Rebecca's remains with practiced efficiency, packaging pieces in contractor bags that would receive burial in scattered forest locations once darkness provided cover for that final phase. Detective Richmond received the call about Rebecca's disappearance that same afternoon. A concerned friend had attempted contact for 2 days without response, eventually driving to Rebecca's property and finding the house locked, vehicles present, but no signs of occupancy. The friend mentioned that Rebecca had hired a handyman for security installation, providing a business card she'd found on Rebecca's kitchen counter. Samuel Cooper's card, complete with phone number, and that damning connection Richmond had been tracking through dozens of missing persons cases. Richmond moved immediately, requesting emergency warrants for Cooper's arrest and the search of his property. Judges, presented with the pattern evidence Richmond had compiled, authorized both requests within hours. Tactical teams assembled as sunset approached, preparing to execute the warrants under cover of darkness to maximize surprise and minimize Cooper's opportunity for destroying evidence or fleeing. But Cooper had anticipated this response. Surveillance teams reported unusual activity at his rental property throughout the afternoon. Trips to his truck carrying what appeared to be bags and containers, extended periods in his basement, and finally his departure at dusk driving in the opposite direction from Rebecca Morrison's property. Richmond ordered immediate pursuit, fearing Cooper might be fleeing the jurisdiction or destroying evidence at some secondary location. The pursuit lasted less than 10 minutes before Cooper pulled into a state park preserve that closed at sunset. Tactical teams surrounded his vehicle, prepared for violent resistance or suicide by cop scenarios. Instead, Cooper emerged with hands raised, offering no resistance, wearing an expression of something resembling relief. He said nothing during the arrest, remaining silent through Miranda warnings and transport to the county jail. His cooperation absolute, but his silence impenetrable. The search of Cooper's property commenced immediately following his arrest, forensic teams descending on the modest rental house with equipment designed to detect blood traces, chemical residues, and biological materials that standard cleaning couldn't eliminate. What they discovered in the basement exceeded even Richmond's darkest expectations. The soundproofing, the reinforced restraint points, the surgical lighting, the drainage systems designed for efficient blood removal. Everything confirmed that this space had served as an extended torture chamber where Cooper had practiced his sadistic craft on victim after victim. Forensic analysis revealed biological evidence from at least 18 different individuals despite Cooper's meticulous cleaning routines. Blood traces in grout lines between concrete blocks. Microscopic tissue samples embedded in wooden surfaces. Hair and fiber evidence trapped in drain assemblies. DNA profiles extracted from these samples matched 9 individuals on Richmond's missing persons lists, providing concrete links between Cooper and victims whose families had spent years wondering about their loved ones' fates. But the discovery that shattered any remaining doubts about Cooper's guilt came from behind the false wall in his basement's northeast corner. There, investigators found the trophy chest, containing identification documents, jewelry, photographs, and personal items from 47 different individuals. Some of these people appeared on missing persons databases. Others had never been reported missing, their solitary lifestyles meaning months or years might pass before anyone noticed their absence. The sheer scope of Cooper's killing spree stunned even veteran investigators accustomed to confronting human depravity. Cooper's journals, discovered hidden in the same compartment, provided horrifying documentation of his crimes. Written in meticulous detail across hundreds of pages, these notebooks described specific murders, documented torture techniques, recorded victims' reactions to various forms of violence, and reflected Cooper's evolving psychological state as his compulsions intensified over time. Some entries read like clinical medical reports. Others descended into disturbing fantasies about future victims and increasingly extreme forms of torture Cooper planned to explore. Reading them left hardened detectives physically ill, the casual tone Cooper employed while describing unthinkable atrocities somehow more disturbing than explicit descriptions of the violence itself. Interrogation sessions with Cooper proved frustrating for investigators. He refused counsel, waived his rights, and agreed to speak with detectives, but his cooperation extended only to confirmation of facts already established through evidence. He admitted to murdering victims whose DNA appeared in his basement. He acknowledged keeping trophies from people he'd killed. He confirmed that his journals contained accurate accounts of his crimes. But he refused to disclose burial locations, wouldn't discuss motivations beyond vague statements about curiosity and experimentation, and declined to provide details about victims whose evidence hadn't yet been recovered. Richmond spent hours across multiple days attempting to understand the man seated across the interview table from her. Cooper appeared unremarkable, average height, average build, forgettable features that blended into any crowd. His voice carried no particular distinction. His mannerisms suggested nothing abnormal. If encountered in a grocery store or hardware shop, no instinct would trigger warnings about his presence. This ordinariness itself disturbed Richmond deeply, the realization that such extreme evil could exist beneath such a mundane exterior, that monsters didn't announce themselves with obvious madness but sometimes simply looked like everyone else. Psychological evaluations commissioned by both prosecution and defense attempted to categorize Cooper within established frameworks for understanding criminal psychopathy. Experts diagnosed antisocial personality disorder, sexual sadism disorder, and narcissistic traits that combine to create a predator lacking empathy, craving control, and deriving pleasure from others' suffering. But these clinical labels felt inadequate when applied to someone whose body count rivaled the most notorious serial killers in American history, whose torture methods demonstrated creativity and escalation that suggested he would have continued indefinitely if circumstances hadn't forced intervention. The trial commenced 18 months after Cooper's arrest, delayed by extensive evidence processing, victim identification efforts, and defense motions that courts rejected but which consumed calendar time nonetheless. Prosecutors charged Cooper with 23 counts of first-degree murder, cases where forensic evidence definitively linked him to victims through DNA, documented confessions in his journals, or recovered trophies that belonged to missing persons. Additional charges included kidnapping, torture, and abuse of corpse specifications that Michigan law permitted. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence across 6 weeks of testimony. Forensic specialists explained how DNA extraction and analysis connected biological samples from Cooper's basement to specific missing persons. Document examiners verified that Cooper's handwriting filled the journals describing torture and murder. Family members of victims provided tearful testimony about loved ones who'd hired Cooper for home repairs before disappearing without explanation. The cumulative effect created an irrefutable narrative of systematic predation spanning more than a decade. Cooper's defense team mounted no meaningful challenge to the evidence. Their strategy focused instead on mental state arguments, suggesting that severe psychological disorders diminished Cooper's capacity for rational thought and should mitigate his culpability. Psychiatric experts testified about abnormal brain development, childhood trauma, and neurological deficits that might explain Cooper's transformation into a serial killer. But prosecution rebuttal witnesses countered that Cooper's careful planning, victim selection strategies, and evidence disposal techniques demonstrated clear consciousness of wrongdoing and sophisticated attempts to avoid detection, factors incompatible with legal insanity. The jury deliberated for 8 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 23 murder counts and associated charges. Cooper showed no reaction as the foreman read each verdict, his expression remaining neutral, his posture relaxed, giving no indication that these pronouncements would result in his spending the remainder of his life in maximum security confinement without possibility of release. When the judge asked if he wished to address the court before sentencing, Cooper declined, offering neither apologies to victims' families nor explanations for his actions. Sentencing occurred 3 weeks later in a courtroom packed with family members of identified victims and representatives from families whose loved ones remained missing, but whose cases shared characteristics suggesting Cooper's involvement. The judge delivered 23 consecutive life sentences without parole possibility, ensuring that even Michigan's prohibition on capital punishment wouldn't result in Cooper ever experiencing freedom again. Before concluding proceedings, the judge departed from typical judicial restraint to deliver a condemnation of Cooper's crimes, describing them as representing depths of human cruelty that challenged comprehension and warranted society's most severe available punishment. Richmond continued investigating Cooper's activities after his conviction, driven by the knowledge that 47 trophies suggested 47 victims, yet definitive evidence existed for only 23. She traveled to states where Cooper had previously resided, interviewed cold case investigators about unsolved missing persons, and attempted to match unidentified remains in forensic databases with individuals Cooper might have murdered before relocating to Michigan. This work yielded probable connections to at least 11 additional victims, cases where circumstantial evidence strongly suggested Cooper's involvement but where conclusive proof remained elusive. Cooper himself refused to provide information that might bring closure to additional families. During prison interviews with investigators, journalists, and criminal psychologists, he maintained his pattern of confirming only what evidence already established while offering no voluntary disclosures about unknown victims or burial locations. Some observers interpreted this as Cooper's final exercise of power, maintaining control over information that families desperately wanted, withholding closure as his last opportunity to inflict suffering on those connected to his crimes. The families of Cooper's identified victims struggled with grief complicated by horrifying details of their loved ones' final hours. Jennifer Walsh's parents learned through trial testimony that their daughter had survived 48 hours of systematic torture before succumbing to accumulated trauma. Michael Patterson's wife and children discovered that he'd spent his last conscious hours worrying about them while Cooper inflicted injuries designed to maximize pain without causing immediate death. Rebecca Morrison's siblings heard forensic testimony about injuries their sister sustained during 36 hours of captivity that ended only when her body's capacity for survival finally reached its limits. Mental health professionals working with these families noted the particular challenges posed by knowing that victims suffered extensively before death. Typical grief processing involved accepting loss and gradually integrating memories of deceased loved ones into ongoing life narratives. But families of torture victims often experienced intrusive thoughts about their loved ones' suffering, nightmares featuring imagined scenes of violence, and psychological trauma resembling secondary traumatization from exposure to horrific details. Therapy could help, but healing remained incomplete when questions persisted about unrecovered remains and whether loved ones had experienced even worse treatment than evidence revealed. Cooper's incarceration at a maximum security facility in northern Michigan isolated him from general prison populations due to the nature of his crimes and the attention his case continued generating. He maintained routine, exercising in solitary yards, reading books from the prison library, occasionally granting interviews with researchers studying criminal psychology. Staff reported that he caused no disciplinary problems, followed institutional rules, and interacted with guards using the same unremarkable courtesy he displayed during his years masquerading as a trustworthy handyman. This normalcy in prison mirrored the normalcy he'd projected while hunting victims, suggesting that Cooper possessed remarkable capacity for compartmentalization, separating the mundane requirements of daily existence from the extreme violence he perpetrated when opportunities arose. Psychologists studying such offenders noted that this ability to maintain dual presentations represented common characteristics among successful serial predators. Individuals who avoided detection by appearing completely ordinary in all contexts except when actively engaged in criminal behavior. Years after Cooper's conviction, searches for additional victims continued sporadically as resources permitted. Forest preserves where Cooper had hunted and hiked received methodical examination using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs trained to detect human remains even decades after burial. These efforts recovered fragmentary remains from 6 individuals, though degradation prevented certain identification in 3 cases. DNA analysis linked recovered bones to missing persons on Richmond's lists, adding to the confirmed victim count but leaving many families still waiting for answers about loved ones who'd vanished during periods coinciding with Cooper's residence in their regions. The question of Cooper's total victim count remained unresolved and likely would never receive a definitive answer. The 47 trophies suggested a minimum baseline, but Cooper might have murdered others without keeping mementos, or some trophies might have been disposed of when he sensed investigation intensifying. Conservative estimates placed his body count between 50 and 60 individuals. Some investigators believed the true number exceeded 80, possibly approaching 100 when victims from his decades of activity across multiple states were fully accounted for. This uncertainty represented Cooper's final victory over the system that imprisoned him, maintaining secrets about crimes that might never face complete accounting, withholding information that could provide closure to families still searching for missing relatives, ensuring that his legacy would include not just the horrors he'd inflicted on identified victims, but ongoing anguish for those who would never know with certainty what had happened to their loved ones. Samuel Cooper, the unremarkable handyman whose toolbox concealed instruments of torture and whose pleasant demeanor masked sadistic compulsions, proved that evil doesn't always announce itself dramatically. Sometimes it arrives with a friendly smile, accepts payment for home repairs, and waits patiently for the perfect moment to transform from helpful contractor into merciless killer. His story serves as grim reminder that predators walk among us, often indistinguishable from ordinary citizens until circumstances reveal the darkness they've successfully hidden behind carefully constructed masks of normalcy. The families Cooper destroyed continue living with losses that time cannot heal and questions that may never receive answers. The investigators who brought him to justice carry memories of crime scenes and testimony that will haunt them long after retirement. And Cooper himself sits in prison, his journals confiscated, his trophies cataloged as evidence, his freedom permanently revoked, but his secrets intact, his final act of cruelty the information he refuses to provide to families still searching for closure in cases that may forever remain unsolved. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The Shadow Among Them. Andre Crawford's Reign of Terror. Your neighbor volunteers to walk children to school. He attends community safety meetings. He applauds when police officers enter the room. And at night, he slips into forgotten buildings where terrible secrets have been left behind. Evil doesn't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes it stands right beside you in plain sight, wearing the appearance of concern while quietly keeping track of lives it has already touched. We're about to descend into the fractured mind of a man who weaponized trust itself. A killer who didn't hide from the manhunt, he joined it. Andre Crawford walked among the very communities he terrorized, offering to protect the vulnerable while systematically destroying them. This isn't just another serial killer story. This is the chilling account of how one man turned an entire neighborhood's fear into his hunting ground, and how the person everyone trusted became the monster they were desperately trying to escape. The morning air hung thick with the scent of industrial decay when the building inspector pushed open the rusted door of the abandoned warehouse on Chicago's South Side. He was there for routine work, checking structural integrity, documenting violations. What he found instead would haunt him for the rest of his life. On the loading dock, partially concealed by debris and shadows, lay the body of a woman. She was naked from the waist down, her clothing scattered around her like discarded thoughts. But it was her face that made seasoned investigators turn away. Brutally beaten beyond recognition, it had been carefully, almost ceremoniously, covered with a piece of cloth. Someone had taken the time to hide what they had done to her features, as if ashamed, or perhaps savoring the ritual of it. Patricia Dunn had been 37 years old. The fingerprints told investigators who she was, but they couldn't tell them who had stolen her life. Described by those who loved her as elegant and a role model, Patricia had lived in Englewood, the same neighborhood where her broken body now lay cooling in an abandoned building. The defensive wounds on her hands told a story of desperate struggle. She had fought, she had tried, and still, she had been left here like refuse, discarded in the architectural skeleton of a forgotten building. The investigators cataloged every detail, the abrasions, the missing shoes while her other clothes remained at the scene, the covered face, the brutality of the head trauma. They suspected sexual assault, though the medical examiner would find no traditional evidence of rape. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that they were staring at the signature of a killer who was just beginning. A killer who had no intention of stopping. A killer who, at that very moment, was probably walking the same streets they would canvass, living among the same neighbors they would interview. The case went cold almost immediately. Without DNA evidence, without witnesses, without fingerprints from the perpetrator, the investigation stalled. The file grew dusty. Patricia Dunn became another statistic in a city where violence was all too common, where bodies in abandoned buildings barely made the news anymore. Her family grieved. The neighborhood whispered, and somewhere Andre Crawford smiled, knowing he had gotten away with it. But he wasn't done. Not even close. 2.5 years passed. 2.5 years of Crawford living freely, moving through the community like a ghost, his secret burning inside him like an addiction he wouldn't control. When children playing in an empty house a few blocks from the first crime scene stumbled upon another body, the similarities were impossible to ignore. They were, as one detective would later describe, striking. Angela Shateen was 36 years old. Like Patricia Dunn before her, she lay nude below the waist, her face savagely beaten and then covered. A cord was wrapped around her neck like a grotesque necklace. Her shoes were missing, but her other clothes remained in the room, arranged in a pattern that suggested this hadn't been random, hadn't been chaotic. This was methodical, intentional, a ritual. The medical examiner delivered news that made the case even more heartbreaking. Angela had been sexually assaulted. She had also been pregnant. 2 lives extinguished in one brutal act of violence. DNA was recovered from her body, critical evidence that should have been the break investigators desperately needed. But in 1995, DNA databases were still in their infancy. Without a suspect to match it against, the genetic material sat in evidence storage, a silent witness waiting to speak. Detective Sergeant Frank Luera stood at the crime scene, his experienced eyes taking in every detail: the covered face, the missing shoes, the abandoned building, the sexual violence. He thought about Patricia Dunn, about the cold case file gathering dust. Something was connecting these women, something beyond coincidence. Someone was hunting in Englewood, selecting victims with a predator's precision, leaving a signature that screamed of a serial offender. But the wheels of justice turn slowly, and sometimes they don't turn at all. The case went cold, joining Patricia Dunn's file in the growing stack of unsolved murders. The killer remained free, unidentified, unstoppable. And with each passing day, his confidence grew. His addiction deepened. The intervals between kills would shorten, the violence would escalate, and the body count would climb. By now, whispers were spreading through Englewood like poison in the water supply. Women who worked the streets, who struggled with addiction, who lived on society's margins, they were disappearing. They were dying. Their bodies were being discovered in the hollow shells of abandoned buildings, each one telling the same horrific story: beaten, violated, discarded, their faces covered, their shoes taken as trophies. The women of Englewood began to understand what the police were still reluctant to publicly acknowledge. There was a predator among them. Someone who knew the neighborhood, someone who understood the rhythms of street life, who knew which buildings were abandoned, which alleys were dark, which women were vulnerable. Someone who could move through the community without raising suspicion, who could blend in, who could even appear helpful, friendly, trustworthy. What they didn't know, what would eventually become the most terrifying revelation of all, was that the killer wasn't hiding from them. He was living with them, working alongside them, attending their community meetings, volunteering to protect their children. He wasn't a stranger lurking in the shadows. He was Andre Crawford, a familiar face, a seemingly harmless man who asked if he could shovel your snow, who seemed concerned about the violence plaguing the neighborhood, who appeared to care about making the streets safer. The irony was so dark, so twisted, it would be almost impossible to believe if it weren't documented fact. The man committing these murders was actively participating in the community's efforts to stop them. While police distributed flyers with composite sketches, Crawford helped hand them out. While residents gathered to discuss safety precautions, Crawford sat among them, listening, learning, adapting. While Operation Safe Passage organized volunteers to escort children safely through dangerous areas, Crawford signed up, offering his protection to the most vulnerable. And all the while, the bodies kept appearing, one after another, each discovery sending fresh waves of terror through a community already drowning in fear. The women knew they were being hunted. They just didn't know that the hunter had been standing beside them all along, wearing the mask of a concerned neighbor, applauding when police entered the room, offering to help in the very investigation designed to capture him. By the time Thanksgiving 1997 arrived, Andre Crawford had perfected his method. He had killed multiple women without consequence, had refined his approach, had grown bolder with each successful murder. He had learned that in an impoverished community plagued by violence and addiction, where resources were scarce and attention was limited, he could kill almost with impunity. The system that should have protected his victims had failed them repeatedly, and Crawford had exploited every crack in that system. But on that Thanksgiving night, something would happen that Crawford hadn't planned for. Something that would eventually lead to his downfall. One of his victims would survive, and her testimony would help bring his reign of terror to an end. Claudia Robinson was 42 years old when she encountered Andre Crawford on the streets of Englewood on Thanksgiving night. The neighborhood was quiet, most families inside enjoying whatever modest celebrations they could afford. Robinson was walking alone, vulnerable in ways that Crawford had learned to recognize, to exploit. He approached her with a familiar proposition. He had drugs. She followed him, a decision that would cost her almost everything, but ultimately save her life and countless others. Crawford led her to an abandoned building, one of many skeletal structures that dotted the south side like tombstones. Once inside, the facade dropped. He pulled out a knife, its blade catching whatever dim light filtered through broken windows. What followed was an attack of unspeakable brutality. Crawford raped Robinson with savage violence. Then he picked up a 2x4 and began to beat her, the wood connecting with her skull again and again, each impact designed to kill. The beating was prolonged, methodical. Crawford wasn't just trying to murder Robinson, he was trying to destroy her. When he finally stopped, satisfied that she was dead, he threw a mattress over her body and took her shoes, adding them to his collection of trophies. Then he left, walking back out into the Thanksgiving night, another successful kill to his credit. But Claudia Robinson wasn't dead. Through sheer force of will, through a survival instinct stronger than the trauma Crawford had inflicted, she had remained conscious enough to understand that her only chance was to play dead, to lie motionless under that mattress while her attacker was still in the building, to wait, to endure. When she was certain Crawford had gone, Robinson dragged her broken body out of that building and found help. She survived, but the cost was devastating. Her right hand would never work properly again. Her leg required a rod to function. The physical scars were permanent, the psychological ones even deeper. But she was alive. And unlike Crawford's other victims, she could identify him. She could describe him. She could help create a composite sketch. For the first time since Patricia Dunn's body had been discovered 4 years earlier, investigators had a living witness. The rape kit from Claudia Robinson's attack yielded DNA evidence. When forensic analysts ran the sample through their database, connections began to form. The genetic material matched DNA found on Angela Chattin's body from 1995. The cases were linked. What police had suspected was now confirmed. A serial offender was operating in Englewood, and he had been active for at least 2 years, probably longer. Robinson worked with detectives to create a composite sketch of her attacker, describing him as a black male, approximately 6 feet tall. The sketch was distributed throughout the neighborhood, appearing on flyers, posted in community centers, shown at safety meetings. Investigators began forging relationships with street-level contacts. Sex workers, gang members, people who lived in the margins and saw things that others didn't. They were building a network, developing leads, getting closer. But Crawford was also at those meetings. He was also looking at those flyers. He was watching the investigation unfold, watching the net slowly tighten, and he kept killing. Because by this point, murder wasn't just something Andre Crawford did. It was who he was. It had become, in his own words, like an addiction he couldn't stop even if he wanted to. And he didn't want to. Between 1997 and 1999, more women died. Their bodies appeared in the same locations Crawford had been using, abandoned buildings scattered throughout Englewood and the surrounding areas. Each victim followed the same pattern. Marginalized women, often struggling with addiction or engaged in sex work, lured to isolated locations with promises of drugs or money. Once there, Crawford would attack, beating them, strangling them, violating them during the assault, and, horrifically, after death. He would steal their shoes as trophies. He would cover their faces. And then he would leave, often returning later to commit further acts of necrophilia, visiting the decomposing bodies like someone returning to a favorite place. The names of his victims deserve to be remembered. Shagwanta Langley, Tommy Dennis, Sanji Brandon, Nicole Townsend, Evandre Harris, Cheryl Cross, Cheryl Johnson, Constance Bailey. Each one was a person with a story, with family, with dreams that were cut short by Crawford's murderous compulsion. Each one fought for their life in those final moments. Each one's death could have been prevented if the system had worked the way it was supposed to. Katrina Martin, a recovering addict who would later testify at Crawford's trial, remembered knowing him during the period when she was exchanging sex for drugs. She lived with a man who allowed crack users to congregate in his apartment, and Crawford was a regular there. So were 6 women who would become his victims: Patricia Dunn, Tommy Dennis, Sanji Brandon, Constance Bailey, Cheryl Johnson, and Shaquanta Langley. Martin recalled Crawford's disturbing statements about these women, how he would say they deserved to die, that they needed to be strangled and have their heads beaten in. At the time, she thought he was just talking, venting frustration. She had no idea he was confessing. Another witness would later come forward with a chilling memory. In December 1999, Crawford sat behind her on a bus and began talking about the Southside murders. He said the victims deserved what happened to them, that they needed to be strangled and have their heads beaten in. The witness started to suspect Crawford might be involved, but even she couldn't fully believe that this familiar, seemingly harmless man could be responsible for such horror. The most disturbing aspect of Crawford's killing spree was how he operated not in the shadows, but in the light. While bodies were being discovered and fear was spreading through Englewood, Crawford was positioning himself as part of the solution. He attended community meetings where police and residents discussed the murders. Detective Trigg would later recount the surreal revelation that Crawford had been at those meetings, applauding when officers arrived, participating in discussions about how to catch the killer himself. Crawford also volunteered for Operation Safe Passage, a program where male volunteers escorted children through dangerous Southside neighborhoods on their way to school. Parents trusted him with their children. The community saw him as someone who cared, who wanted to help. Neighbors would later express shock, saying things like, "You would never expect it. This is a man who'd ask if he could shovel your snow. This wasn't just a serial killer evading capture. This was a predator who had embedded himself so deeply into the community's response to his own crimes that he became virtually invisible." He was listening to investigative updates, learning what evidence police had, understanding how close they were getting. He was adapting his methods based on information shared at community meetings. He was using his volunteer work to maintain his cover as a trustworthy, concerned citizen. The psychological manipulation was staggering. Crawford wasn't just killing women. He was playing a game with an entire community, deriving additional pleasure from his ability to hide in plain sight, to be praised for the very civic-mindedness that provided cover for his murders. It was a level of psychopathy that went beyond the killings themselves, extending into every interaction, every volunteer shift, every community meeting where he sat among the families of his victims and pretended to care about bringing their killer to justice. After years of terror, after 11 murders and 1 attempted murder, the break investigators had been desperately seeking finally came from the community itself. 2 women came forward with information about a man they knew as Dre. They described him as someone known for getting violent with women in abandoned buildings. Another contact mentioned a man named Andre who would get high with sex workers in empty buildings. The pieces were coming together, pointing toward a specific individual. Andre Crawford. Investigators ran his name and discovered he was from the area, had a criminal history including arrests for drugs and sexual assault. He occasionally worked on Chicago Sun-Times distribution trucks. He fit the physical description Claudia Robinson had provided. And critically, his criminal record meant his fingerprints were on file. More importantly, due to a 1999 arrest, authorities had collected a DNA sample from him. On January 28, 2000, police brought Crawford in for questioning. At first, he refused to provide another DNA sample, but when officers presented him with a court order, he complied. The sample was rushed to the lab, and when the results came back, they confirmed what investigators had suspected. Andre Crawford's DNA matched the genetic material found at multiple crime scenes. He was linked to 7 of the murders through forensic evidence that left no room for doubt. But what happened next would shock even the seasoned detectives who thought they had seen everything. When confronted with the evidence, Crawford didn't lawyer up immediately. He didn't deny involvement. Instead, he confessed. And he didn't just confess to the 7 murders they could prove with DNA. He admitted to 4 additional killings that investigators hadn't even connected to the case. In total, Andre Crawford confessed to murdering 11 women. The confession was recorded on video, and what it revealed was a window into a mind utterly devoid of remorse. Crawford calmly recounted his crimes, describing in methodical detail how he selected victims, how he lured them to abandoned buildings, how he killed them. He explained his modus operandi with the detachment of someone describing a routine task, not the systematic destruction of human lives. He told investigators about Patricia Dunn, his first victim. They had agreed on exchanging cocaine for sex, he said, but the transaction soured when Dunn wanted the drugs before performing sexual acts. This angered Crawford, triggering a violent rage. He struck her repeatedly in the head and face with pliers, the blows crushing her skull, destroying her features. Then, as she lay dying, he sexually assaulted her. The covering of her face, the taking of her shoes, these weren't accidental details. They were part of his ritual, part of the signature he would repeat with victim after victim. When asked why he killed, Crawford was chillingly matter-of-fact. He told investigators that he murdered the women because of their trickery, because they would demand drugs or money. He admitted telling Claudia Robinson that he wanted to rape her to teach her a lesson. The complete lack of empathy, the way he framed his victims as deserving their fate, the casual tone in which he described acts of unspeakable violence, all of it painted a picture of someone who had thoroughly dehumanized the women he killed, who saw them not as people but as objects to be used and discarded. Perhaps most disturbing was Crawford's admission that killing had become an addiction for him. He stated plainly that he wouldn't have stopped on his own, that the compulsion to kill was too strong, too integrated into who he had become. Each murder fed the addiction, requiring another to satisfy the craving. And because his victims were marginalized women in an underserved community, because the system repeatedly failed to stop him, he had been able to feed that addiction for 6 years, taking 11 lives and attempting to take a 12th. As the investigation deepened, a heartbreaking reality emerged. Andre Crawford's killing spree could have been prevented. In March 1993, just months before Patricia Dunn's murder, Crawford had been arrested for felony theft. At that time, Illinois law did not mandate DNA collection for theft charges. If a sample had been taken then, it would have been in the system when DNA was recovered from Angela Chattin's body in 1995. The subsequent murders could have been stopped. Even more frustrating, Crawford had been arrested on May 3, 1995, for attempted criminal sexual abuse. He spent over a year in Cook County Jail while the case was investigated. But the victim refused to cooperate, her testimony was deemed unreliable, and the charges were eventually dropped. Crawford was released. Again, no DNA sample was collected. Again, an opportunity to stop him was missed. If the criminal justice system had functioned properly at any of these intervention points, 10 women might still be alive. Claudia Robinson might not be disabled, struggling with permanent injuries. Families might not be grieving, but the system failed repeatedly and catastrophically, and Crawford exploited every failure. Crawford's confession also exposed another miscarriage of justice. He admitted to killing Rhonda King, but another man, Hubert Geralds, had already been convicted of that murder and sentenced to death. Geralds had been on death row since 1998 for King's murder and 5 others. Crawford's confession proved that at least one of those convictions was wrong. The Cook County Prosecutor's Office announced they would overturn Gerald's conviction for the King murder. DNA testing confirmed that Crawford, not Gerald's, had killed her. Gerald's was exonerated of that specific murder, though he remained incarcerated for the 5 other murders he had been legitimately convicted of. The case became a stark example of how wrongful convictions happen, how coerced confessions and prosecutorial pressure can lead to innocent people being condemned to death, how the death penalty system is irreversibly flawed. Andre Crawford was charged with 10 counts of first-degree murder, 11 counts of aggravated criminal sexual assault, and 1 count of attempted murder. The charges encompassed his entire killing spree, from Patricia Dunn in 1993 to his final victim in 1999. Each count represented a life destroyed, a family shattered, a community traumatized. The trial wouldn't happen quickly, due to numerous factors: judicial errors in both Crawford's case and the wrongly convicted Hubert Gerald's case, a moratorium on the death penalty in Illinois, countless motions from both defense and prosecution, Crawford's trial was delayed for nearly a decade. He spent 9 years and 10 months in Cook County Jail awaiting trial, longer than any other inmate in Illinois history. The delays tortured the victims' families, who waited year after year for justice, watching Crawford sit in jail while their loved ones remained dead. Their grief never quite able to find resolution without a verdict. But in November 2009, nearly 17 years after Patricia Dunn's body was discovered, Andre Crawford's trial finally began. The courtroom would become a place where unspeakable horror was recounted, where a community's pain was laid bare, where the question of what punishment fits such monstrous crimes would be debated by a jury of his peers. The courtroom fell silent as the trial of Andre Crawford began in December 2009. Family members of the 11 murdered women filled the gallery, their faces etched with years of grief and anticipation. They had waited nearly a decade for this moment, for the opportunity to finally see the man who had destroyed their families held accountable. Across from them sat Andre Crawford, the man who had terrorized their community, who had attended their safety meetings, who had volunteered to protect their children while simultaneously hunting their sisters, mothers, and aunts. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They presented DNA evidence linking Crawford to 7 of the murders. They played his videotaped confessions, forcing the jury to hear Crawford describe his crimes in his own words, with his characteristic lack of remorse. They called Claudia Robinson to testify, the only woman who had survived Crawford's attack, who bore permanent disabilities from the beating she endured. They presented forensic evidence, crime scene photographs, testimony from investigators who had spent years hunting Crawford while he hid among them in plain sight. The defense, led by attorney Deborah Seaton, attempted to paint a picture of a man shaped by unspeakable trauma and abuse. They called Alice Washington, a consultant, who testified about Crawford's alleged history of neglect and abuse, though she acknowledged that most of the allegations came from Crawford himself and were uncorroborated by evidence. Records showed Crawford and his sister had been placed in foster care as infants after authorities found them living alone in squalor, after their mother admitted to leaving them unattended for extended periods. Dr. John Fabian, a forensic neuropsychologist, testified about Crawford's childhood and his relationship with his mother. Crawford had claimed she was negligent and abusive, that she had prostituted both herself and her son when he was 14 years old. Fabian theorized that Crawford hated his mother and was hostile toward women in general, taking out his rage on his victims. The covered faces, Fabian suggested, might indicate shame or regret. The choice of victims, women involved in prostitution or struggling with addiction, women who reminded Crawford of his mother, supported this theory. But Crawford's sister, adoptive parents, and other relatives denied his claims of abuse. His adoptive father stated that Crawford had become addicted to drugs in the mid-1970s, leading him to drop out of school at 17. Crawford had enlisted in the Army and later the Navy, but continued using drugs, was constantly disciplined, and was eventually dishonorably discharged. After returning to Chicago, he lived in squalor, using drugs heavily, changing jobs frequently, living in abandoned buildings and homeless shelters when he couldn't secure housing. The defense's narrative was one of a broken man, a product of trauma and addiction, someone who deserved understanding if not forgiveness. But the prosecution countered with the sheer brutality of Crawford's crimes, the calculated nature of his attacks, the necrophilia, the trophy-taking, the way he had manipulated an entire community while methodically destroying its most vulnerable members. They argued that regardless of his past, Crawford had made conscious choices to lure, rape, torture, and murder 11 women. He had confessed that killing had become an addiction, that he wouldn't have stopped on his own. After a month-long trial, the jury deliberated for 10 hours before returning their verdict on December 17, 2009. Andre Crawford was found guilty on all counts: 11 counts of murder, 11 counts of aggravated criminal sexual assault, and 1 count of attempted murder. The courtroom erupted in emotion as the verdict was read. Some family members wept softly. Others sat in stunned silence. The reality of justice finally arrived, washing over them after years of waiting. But the trial wasn't over. Illinois law required a second phase to determine whether Crawford would receive the death penalty or life imprisonment. To be eligible for the death penalty in Illinois, A defendant must be convicted of at least 2 murders. Crawford had been convicted of 11. Under the law, he was clearly eligible for execution. The prosecution argued forcefully for the death penalty. It only takes 2 killings to be eligible for death, they reminded the jury. This was 11. 11 women systematically murdered. 11 families destroyed. An entire community terrorized. They emphasized Crawford's own admission that he would not have stopped killing, that murder had become an addiction he couldn't control. They pointed to the necrophilia, the trophy-taking, the complete lack of remorse. This was not a man who deserved mercy, they argued. This was a monster who deserved the ultimate punishment. The defense, however, continued to emphasize Crawford's traumatic childhood, his drug addiction, his mental health issues. They argued that killing him wouldn't bring back his victims, wouldn't heal the community, wouldn't serve any purpose beyond vengeance. They pointed to the systemic failures that had allowed Crawford to keep killing, suggesting that society bore some responsibility for not intervening sooner. The jury deliberated on the death penalty, but ultimately couldn't reach a unanimous verdict, which Illinois law required for a death sentence. On December 18, 2009, Judge Evelyn Clay announced that Crawford would be sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Crawford sat motionless, showing no reaction as his fate was sealed. His fingers interlaced before him. He displayed no emotion. Even his gasps and sobs rose from the courtroom gallery. The verdict sparked intense emotional reactions. Rena Carlock, sister of victim Patricia Dunn, expressed her outrage. It only takes 2 killings to be eligible for death. It was 11. What kind of justice is that? The brother of another victim, Cheryl Cross, claimed he saw Crawford smile when the death sentence was rejected. Tyrone Cotton, Cheryl's brother, tried to find solace in faith, gathering nearly 3 dozen relatives in the courthouse lobby for a prayer circle. "We pray to God for strength to carry on," he said. "Despite the verdict, we carry on. We have life within ourselves. Our sisters, our mothers, our aunts live within us." But no one was more devastated than Claudia Robinson, the only woman to survive Crawford's attacks, disabled, suffering permanent injuries from the beating that nearly killed her. Robinson felt betrayed by the jury's decision. "I waited 12 years for justice, and this is what I get?" she demanded. For her, life imprisonment wasn't enough. Crawford had stolen her health, her independence, her sense of safety. She lived every day with the physical and psychological scars of his violence. She had faced him in court, relived her trauma in testimony, and still he escaped the ultimate punishment. Andre Crawford was sent to Menard Correctional Center in southern Illinois to serve his life sentence. He would never again walk the streets of Englewood, never again volunteer to escort children to school, never again sit in community meetings while secretly counting his victims. But his story wasn't quite finished. In March 2017, just days before what would have been his 55th birthday, Andre Crawford developed hepatocellular carcinoma, an aggressive form of liver cancer. His health deteriorated rapidly. On March 18, 2017, exactly 2 days before his birthday, Crawford died from complications of the disease. An Illinois Department of Corrections spokesperson confirmed his death, which received no media attention at the time. The monster who had terrorized Chicago's South Side for 6 years, who had murdered 11 women and attempted to murder a 12th, who had hidden among the very community he victimized, died quietly in prison, his name barely remembered outside the families who would never forget. The Andre Crawford case exposed systemic failures at every level. It revealed how marginalized communities are underserved by law enforcement, how women struggling with addiction and involved in sex work are deemed less worthy of protection, how multiple opportunities to stop a serial killer can be missed because the system doesn't function the way it should. Crawford's crimes continued for 6 years partly because of who his victims were. Women's society often overlooks, dismisses, dehumanizes. The case also highlighted the danger of serial killers who operate not by hiding, but by integrating themselves into the community. Crawford wasn't a reclusive stranger skulking in shadows. He was a neighbor, a volunteer, someone who attended community meetings and helped distribute safety flyers. His ability to hide in plain sight, to use civic engagement as cover for his crimes represented a particularly insidious form of predation. For the families of his victims, for Claudia Robinson, for the Englewood community that was terrorized throughout the 1990s, Crawford's death in prison provided some measure of closure, but it couldn't heal the wounds he inflicted. 11 women are still dead. Families are still broken. A community still carries the trauma of knowing that the person they trusted was the monster they feared. Andre Crawford's story is a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it wears a friendly face, offers to help, shows up to community meetings, and volunteers to walk children safely to school. Sometimes the greatest danger comes not from the stranger in the shadows, but from the familiar face standing beside you, wearing a mask of concern while counting victims in secret. The women Crawford murdered deserve to be remembered not as statistics, not as prostitutes or drug addicts, but as human beings who lived, who struggled, who mattered. Patricia Dunn, Angela Shateen, Shagwanta Langley, Tommy Dennis, Sanji Brandon, Nicole Townsend, Evandre Harris, Cheryl Cross, Cheryl Johnson, Constance Bailey, and Rhonda King. Their lives were stolen by a predator who exploited every systemic failure, who weaponized trust itself, who turned an entire community's fear into his hunting ground. And Claudia Robinson, the one who survived, lives on, disabled but unbowed, bearing witness to both Crawford's monstrosity and the resilience of those who refused to let his crimes define them forever. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. The 2-Minute Promise. The Vanishing of Trevelyan Evans. Sometimes the most ordinary moments become thresholds to the unthinkable, and on a bright Saturday morning in June 1990, a handwritten note left on a shop door would become one of the most haunting artifacts in British missing persons history. The morning sun illuminated the narrow medieval streets of Llangollen, a picturesque Welsh town nestled in the Dee Valley, where stone bridges arched over rushing water and tourists wandered through shops selling antiques and Welsh crafts. At precisely 9:30 in the morning, 52-year-old Trevelyan Evans unlocked the door to Attic Antiques on Church Street, beginning what appeared to be an entirely unremarkable day. She had driven her dark blue Ford Escort from nearby Market Street, parking it roughly 200 yards from the shop, carrying with her some fresh fruit and flowers she planned to take home later that evening. The grandmother moved through her morning routine with practiced ease. Friends dropped by. Customers browsed the Victorian jewelry and vintage collectibles that lined her shelves. Everyone who spoke with Trevelyan that morning would later tell investigators the same thing. She seemed perfectly normal, cheerful even, making casual plans for the evening ahead. There was no distress in her voice, no tension in her movements, nothing to suggest that within hours, she would step through her shop door and disappear so completely that decades later, not a single trace of her would ever be found. Around 12:30 in the afternoon, witnesses recalled seeing a well-dressed man inside Attic Antiques, speaking with Trevelyan. The conversation appeared casual, unremarkable. Shortly after 12:40, Trevelyan did something she had done countless times before. She left her shop briefly, placing a handwritten note on the door. The message was simple, ordinary, the kind left by shopkeepers throughout Britain every single day. "Back in 2 minutes," it read. She crossed Church Street and purchased an apple and a banana from a local shop. Witnesses saw her moving through the town center, navigating the Saturday afternoon crowds. She was last definitively seen at approximately 2:30 that afternoon near her home on Market Street, less than a quarter mile from her shop. Then Trevelyan Evans ceased to exist in any verifiable way. She didn't return to remove the note. She didn't open the shop. She didn't go home. She simply vanished, as though she had stepped through an invisible doorway into nothing. When concern finally crystallized into alarm that evening, family members contacted North Wales Police. The response was immediate. Officers arrived at Attic Antiques to find a scene that would perplex them for decades. The shop was exactly as Trevelyan had left it. Her handbag remained inside, undisturbed. Her car keys sat where she had placed them. Her jacket hung on its hook. The fruit and flowers she had brought that morning waited on a counter, intended for a home she would never return to. Her car remained parked on Market Street, untouched, gathering the evening shadows. Inside the shop's small waste bin, investigators found a banana peel. Had Trevelyan returned briefly after making her purchase? Had she eaten the banana in those mysterious minutes between being seen at 2:30 and her complete disappearance? Or had someone else been in the shop? The question hung in the air like smoke, impossible to grasp. Within hours of the initial report, the investigation expanded with the urgency appropriate to a missing person case in a small town. Every business along Church Street was contacted. Every residence within sight of the shop was visited. Officers moved through Llangollen systematically, documenting timelines, gathering statements, searching for the critical details that could explain the inexplicable. They checked her bank accounts and found them untouched. No withdrawals. No unusual transactions. Nothing to suggest preparation for departure or life elsewhere. As midnight approached, marking 12 hours since Trevelyan's last confirmed sighting, the search parameters expanded. Officers with torches moved along the banks of the River Dee, their lights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the water's surface. Search teams were dispatched to the nearby canal. The surrounding countryside, with its abandoned mine shafts and hidden caves, became a focus of intense scrutiny. Every hollow, every shadow, every concealed space that could hold a body was examined with growing desperation. By dawn on Sunday, June 17th, less than 24 hours into the investigation, a disquieting reality had settled over the inquiry team. They had no witnesses to an abduction, no evidence of violence, no ransom demand, no suicide note, no indication that Trevelyan Evans had planned to disappear. What they had instead was a woman who had walked out of her shop intending to be gone for 2 minutes and had never been seen again. The decision was made to treat this as a potential homicide investigation. The classification wasn't made lightly. Trevelyan was a respected businesswoman with strong family connections. Her only son, Richard Jr., was himself a police sergeant in his early 20s. Her husband, Richard Sr., had been renovating their holiday bungalow near Rutland during the week of her disappearance and was quickly ruled out as a suspect based on multiple verified alibis. Everything about Trevelyan's life suggested stability, contentment, normalcy. Detective Chief Inspector Colin Edwards, assigned to lead the investigation, recognized immediately that the first 48 hours would be absolutely critical. In missing persons cases, particularly those involving potential foul play, the initial window represented the best chance to find witnesses whose memories were fresh, to preserve evidence before it degraded, and to track movements before trails went cold. Every hour that passed without finding Trevelyan meant the probability of finding her alive diminished exponentially. The incident room at North Wales Police Headquarters transformed into a nerve center of activity. Officers worked around the clock, conducting interviews, cross-referencing statements, building timelines with obsessive precision. The well-dressed man seen speaking with Trevelyan before her disappearance became a person of intense interest. Who was he? What had they discussed? Where had he gone after leaving the shop? An artist was brought in to create a composite sketch based on witness descriptions. The image showed a man in a blazer, professional-looking, unremarkable in every way except that he might have been one of the last people to see Trevelyan Evans before she vanished. As the 48-hour mark approached, the investigation had generated more questions than answers. Every household in Llangollen had been contacted. More than 1,500 names had been documented. 700 vehicles had been identified and their owners interviewed. Search teams had covered miles of countryside. And yet, Trevelyan remained as absent as if she had never existed at all. The psychology of those first 2 days would haunt everyone involved. In the crucial hours when evidence was freshest, when witnesses were most accessible, when the trail was warmest, the investigation had found nothing. Not a fiber, Not a footprint. Not a single drop of blood. The complete absence of evidence became its own kind of evidence, suggesting either extraordinary planning or extraordinary luck on the part of whoever was responsible for Trevelyan's disappearance. By Monday morning, 72 hours after Trevelyan had left that note on her door, Detective Chief Inspector Edwards held a press conference. His words were carefully chosen, measured, but the frustration was evident beneath the professional veneer. The investigation, he explained, was one of the strangest he had encountered in his career. The circumstances defied conventional logic. A happily married woman had vanished without a trace from a busy town center on a sunny Saturday afternoon. She had left behind everything she owned, everything she valued, and walked into some unknown fate that had consumed her so completely that the earth itself seemed to have swallowed every trace. The first 48 hours had passed. The critical window had closed, and Trevelyan Evans remained nowhere to be found. The realization settled over Llangollen like morning frost. One of their own had been taken, and whoever had done it had done so with such precision that even in the immediate aftermath, with police presence saturating every street corner and witness memory at its sharpest, not a single credible lead had emerged. The town's character changed in subtle ways. Conversations in the local shops carried an undercurrent of unease. Parents kept their children closer. Women looked over their shoulders when walking alone. The sense of safety that had defined this close-knit community had been fractured by absence itself. Detective Chief Inspector Edwards and his team expanded their investigation methodology as the initial burst of activity gave way to the grinding work of systematic analysis. The composite sketch of the well-dressed man was circulated throughout Wales and beyond, appearing in newspapers, posted in shop windows, broadcast on regional television news. Tips began flooding in. Each one had to be followed, verified, documented. Each potential sighting investigated. Each claimed recognition pursued to its conclusion. And each one ultimately led nowhere. The investigation team employed every resource available to a 1990s police force. Helicopter searches covered the mountainous terrain surrounding Llangollen, pilots scanning the landscape for any sign of a body, any disturbance in the natural patterns of vegetation that might indicate recent burial. Divers descended into the darker reaches of the River Dee and the Llangollen Canal, searching the murky waters where a weighted body might have been disposed of. Spelunkers explored the network of abandoned mine shafts that dotted the Welsh countryside, their lamps illuminating spaces that hadn't been disturbed in decades. The BBC's Crime Watch program featured Trevelyan's case not once but twice, broadcasting dramatic reconstructions of her last known movements to millions of viewers across the United Kingdom. The reconstruction showed an actress portraying Trevelyan opening her shop, greeting customers, leaving the note on the door, purchasing fruit from the shop across the street. The broadcast generated thousands of calls to the incident room, each one logged, investigated, and ultimately dismissed as the leads evaporated under scrutiny. Theories proliferated in the absence of facts. Some suggested Trevelyan had planned her own disappearance, orchestrating an elaborate escape from her life. This possibility was examined thoroughly and dismissed for multiple compelling reasons. Her bank accounts remained untouched, all her money sitting idle in accounts she could have accessed if she had been living elsewhere. Her passport was found at home, limiting her ability to travel internationally. Perhaps most convincingly, everyone who knew Trevelyan described a woman deeply connected to her family, her business, her community. The idea that she would abandon her son, particularly given that he was a police officer who would spend years searching for her, seemed psychologically implausible. Others wondered if Trevelyan had met with some tragic accident. Perhaps she had fallen into a hidden mine shaft or been swept away by the river's current. But this theory too crumbled under examination. The time frame was too tight. The last confirmed sighting placed her near her home on Market Street at 2:30 in the afternoon. The terrain between that location and any natural hazard that could have claimed her was populated, visible, frequently traveled. For her to have accidentally died in such a public area without anyone witnessing it required a coincidence that strained credibility. The most unsettling theory, and the one that gained traction among investigators, was the simplest. Trevelyan had been abducted. Someone had lured her away from the busy town center, or forced her into a vehicle, or convinced her to go somewhere under false pretenses, and then had killed her and disposed of her body with such thoroughness that no trace remained. This scenario required premeditation, planning, and a level of ruthlessness that was deeply disturbing. It also raised the question that haunted everyone involved. If someone had planned this so carefully, had Trevelyan been specifically targeted, or had she been a victim of opportunity, wrong place and wrong time? As summer faded into autumn, the investigation began to encounter the inevitable entropy that affects all prolonged cases. Officers were reassigned to other matters. The daily briefings became weekly, then monthly. The incident room was eventually closed, though the files remained active. Detective Chief Inspector Edwards continued to pursue leads as they emerged, but the momentum that had characterized those first frantic weeks had dissipated into the patient, grinding work of a cold case. In October 1990, Richard Evans, Trevelyan's husband, made a public appeal, offering a substantial reward for information leading to his wife's whereabouts. His statement to the press was measured but heartbreaking. He spoke of a loving marriage, a shared dream of retirement in their Rutland bungalow, plans for the future that had been obliterated by whatever had happened on that Saturday in June. The reward generated renewed media attention but, crucially, produced no actionable intelligence. Throughout this period, reported sightings of Trevelyan emerged from increasingly distant locations. A woman resembling her description was supposedly spotted in London. Another potential sighting came from France, prompting Interpol to conduct inquiries that ultimately proved fruitless. Most bizarrely, a report surfaced suggesting Trevelyan had been seen in a remote town in Australia, living under an assumed identity. Each sighting was investigated with appropriate diligence. Each one, upon scrutiny, proved to be either misidentification or deliberate hoax. The strangest leads came from individuals claiming psychic abilities. In 1992, a self-proclaimed spiritual medium contacted police, insisting that Trevelyan's body could be found in woodland near an area called World's End, a dramatic section of the Llangollen Hills. Officers dutifully searched the location and found nothing. The following year, another individual contacted investigators claiming to feel an overwhelming sensation that Trevelyan's remains were located near a canal bank. Police deployed sniffer dogs specifically trained to detect human remains. Again, nothing was found. Detective Chief Inspector Edwards, in a rare moment of public candor, described the case as without doubt the strangest inquiry he had ever worked. His words captured the fundamental bewilderment that defined the investigation. How could a woman vanish so completely from a busy town center on a Saturday afternoon? How could there be no witnesses, no evidence, no trail to follow? The physics of disappearance itself seemed to have been violated. By the time 1990 became 1991, the investigation had documented every conceivable avenue of inquiry. Over 1,500 individuals had been interviewed. 700 vehicles had been traced and eliminated. Every cave, mine shaft, and waterway within a reasonable distance of Llangollen had been searched. Thousands of man-hours had been devoted to finding Trevelyan Evans or discovering what had happened to her. And the result of all this effort was a profound, unsettling silence. The case became a fixture of local consciousness, a reference point for other mysteries, a cautionary tale told to children about the fragility of safety. Trevelyan's shop remained closed, eventually being converted into a private residence. The space where she had spent her final documented hours transformed into something else entirely. Her car was eventually removed from Market Street. Her belongings were stored or distributed. Life continued as it must, but the absence remained, a vacuum in the shape of a woman who had promised to be back in 2 minutes. For investigators, the absence of resolution was particularly frustrating because they understood intuitively that the answers existed. Someone knew what had happened. Whether it was the person responsible or a witness who had seen something crucial without recognizing its significance, the information existed somewhere in the collective memory of those who had been in Llangollen that day. The challenge was finding it, coaxing it forth from whatever psychological hiding place it occupied. As the first anniversary of Trevelyan's disappearance approached, her family held a private remembrance service. Richard Sr. attended, his grief still raw despite the passage of 12 months. Their son, Richard Jr., now deeply involved in his police career, struggled with the unique torture of being both victim's family and law enforcement officer, unable to solve the case that mattered most. The service was quiet, dignified, marked by the terrible ambiguity of mourning someone who might still be alive, somewhere, though no one truly believed that anymore. The investigation continued, but it had shifted from active pursuit to patient monitoring, waiting for the break that might never come, hoping that time or conscience or chance might eventually illuminate what had happened during those mysterious hours when Trevelyan Evans walked out of her shop and into oblivion. As the calendar pages turned and years accumulated like dust, the Trevelyan Evans case settled into that peculiar category of investigations that are never officially closed but exist in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the catalyst that might resurrect them. The file grew thicker with each reported sighting, each new theory, each revisitation by officers hoping that fresh eyes might spot what their predecessors had missed. But the fundamental mystery remained impenetrable, a locked room with no key. The case periodically resurfaced in public consciousness, usually on significant anniversaries or when regional media needed content about unsolved mysteries. Each resurgence brought new tips, new supposed witnesses, new individuals claiming to have seen something crucial. Each tip was dutifully followed by increasingly skeptical investigators who had learned to temper hope with the reality that most leads, even the seemingly promising ones, evaporated under examination. In 1999, tragedy compounded tragedy when Richard Jr., Trevelyan's son, died suddenly of a heart attack in his late 30s. The police sergeant who had spent 9 years desperately trying to find his mother passed away without ever learning her fate. For Richard Sr., now in his 80s, the loss was incomprehensible. He had lost his wife to unknown circumstances and his son to a cruel coincidence of biology and stress, leaving him alone with questions that would never be answered in his lifetime. The turn of the millennium brought renewed attention to cold cases throughout Britain, driven partly by advances in forensic science that offered new possibilities for old investigations. DNA analysis had revolutionized criminal investigations, offering the potential to extract meaningful evidence from samples that would have been useless a decade earlier. Digital databases allowed for unprecedented cross-referencing of information. Geographic profiling provided new ways to analyze patterns of criminal behavior. In January 2001, 11 years after Trevelyan's disappearance, North Wales Police announced they were reopening the investigation with a dedicated team of 10 officers. The decision was made with considerable optimism. Forensic techniques had advanced dramatically since 1990. Witness memories, though faded, might still contain useful details. The composite sketch of the well-dressed man was officially discarded as potentially inaccurate, freeing investigators from pursuing leads based on what might have been flawed witness descriptions. The 2001 investigation took an unexpected and dramatic turn. In June of that year, 72-year-old Richard Evans, Trevelyan's husband, was arrested on suspicion of having information about his wife's disappearance. The arrest shocked the Llangollen community, where Richard had been viewed as a victim rather than a suspect. He was taken to Wrexham Police Station for questioning, a process that must have been surreal for a man who had spent 11 years grieving his missing wife. The interrogation lasted for hours. Officers pressed Richard on inconsistencies in his timeline, on his whereabouts during the critical period of Trevelyan's disappearance, on the nature of their marriage, on financial matters, on everything that might provide a motive or opportunity for him to have harmed his wife. Richard maintained his innocence throughout, insisting that he had been at their Rutland bungalow during the crucial hours, that their marriage had been solid, that he had no involvement in whatever had happened to Trevelyan. After extensive questioning and investigation, police released Richard without charge. The evidence, or rather the lack of it, simply didn't support the theory that he had been involved. His alibi for the day of Trevelyan's disappearance had been verified multiple times. There was no forensic evidence linking him to any crime. The financial records showed no motive. The arrest had been a last-ditch effort to shake loose some hidden truth, and it had failed. The 2001 investigation ultimately concluded in August without producing any new leads. Officers had re-examined every piece of evidence, re-interviewed witnesses where possible, applied new forensic techniques to old samples, and found nothing that moved the case forward. The file was returned to its state of inactive monitoring, and the optimism that had accompanied the reopening dissipated into renewed frustration. In 2010, the 20th anniversary of Trevelyan's disappearance prompted another formal review. 2 decades had passed since that Saturday in June, and the landscape of the investigation had changed dramatically. Many of the original witnesses were now elderly or deceased. The physical spaces where events had occurred had been altered by time and development. The officers who had worked the initial investigation had mostly retired. But Leonard Davies, Trevelyan's younger brother, refused to let her memory fade. He spoke publicly about his continuing hope that the case would be solved, that someone would come forward, that some piece of information would emerge from the shadows. The 2010 review examined a troubling new angle. Police investigated a possible connection between Trevelyan's disappearance and Robin Ligas, a convicted serial killer who had murdered 3 men in 1994. Ligas had a disturbing pattern. He targeted men, often killing them in their homes, using different methods for each victim. One of his victims had been an antiques dealer, killed approximately 30 miles from Llangollen. The geographic proximity and the victim profile created an uncomfortable overlap with Trevelyan's case. Investigators interviewed Ligas in prison, where he was serving a life sentence. He had reportedly admitted to other killings beyond those for which he had been convicted, suggesting a much longer history of violence than was officially acknowledged. But after thorough investigation, police ruled out any connection to Trevelyan's disappearance. The timelines didn't align. Ligas's modus operandi didn't match. The evidence, such as it was, didn't support the theory. The ruling out of Ligas as a suspect was simultaneously a relief and a disappointment. Relief because the alternative was that Trevelyan had suffered at the hands of a known monster. Disappointment because it meant the investigation was back to having no viable suspects, no clear direction, no path forward except continued waiting. Throughout these cold years, the Evans family endured their private agony largely away from public scrutiny. Richard Sr., growing increasingly frail, never stopped hoping that before he died, he might learn what had happened to his wife. He maintained their home as it had been, her belongings preserved as though she might return at any moment. Friends described him as a man haunted by absence, forever waiting for a phone call that would finally provide closure. The case occasionally intersected with other investigations. Officers working missing persons cases throughout Britain would reference the Evans file, looking for patterns, commonalities, anything that might suggest a serial offender operating across different regions. Cold case specialists would review the documentation, hoping their specialized expertise might spot something previous investigators had missed. Academic researchers studying disappearances would analyze the case as an example of how someone could vanish so completely in a populated area. For the residents of Llangollen, Trevelyan's disappearance became part of the town's identity, a dark thread woven through its history. The older generation remembered her personally, could recall conversations in her shop, her friendly demeanor, the shock of her vanishing. Younger residents knew her primarily as a cautionary legend, the woman who left a note saying she'd be back in 2 minutes and never returned. The shop that had been Attic Antiques was pointed out to visitors as a landmark of unsolved mystery. The investigative file itself grew to enormous proportions, containing thousands of pages of witness statements, forensic reports, search documentation, follow-up inquiries, and dead-end leads. It represented countless hours of police work, an immense expenditure of resources devoted to finding one missing woman. And yet, for all its bulk, for all the information it contained, the file couldn't answer the only question that mattered. What happened to Trevelyan Evans? In 2015, Richard Sr. died at the age of 83. He passed away never knowing his wife's fate, carrying the burden of that uncertainty to his grave. His death meant that both of Trevelyan's immediate family members were gone, leaving only her brother Leonard and extended family to carry forward the hope of resolution. The funeral was attended by many who remembered both Richard and Trevelyan, a community still bound together by shared grief and enduring mystery. The cold years had taken their toll, transforming the urgent, active investigation of 1990 into the patient, almost archaeological work of 2015. Evidence degraded, witnesses died, memories faded, the trail already cold became glacial. And yet the case persisted, refusing to close, maintained as active by North Wales Police under the principle that no unsolved case is ever truly closed, that justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied, that somewhere in the accumulated documentation might be the detail that would finally illuminate the darkness. The third decade of the Trevelyan Evans investigation brought unexpected developments that would inject new energy into what had become the coldest of cold cases. The digital age had transformed investigative possibilities, creating tools and methodologies that simply hadn't existed when Trevelyan first disappeared. Social media allowed for unprecedented public engagement with cold cases. Genealogical databases offered revolutionary approaches to identifying unknown remains. Advanced ground-penetrating radar could detect disturbances in soil that earlier searches had missed. The question was whether any of these advances could finally crack a case that had resisted solution for so long. In 2019, nearly 3 decades after Trevelyan's disappearance, 2 brothers named Andy and Lee Sutton contacted police with an extraordinary claim. They believed they had located Trevelyan's remains, and they insisted they had proof. Their story was specific and disturbing. They claimed her body had been buried beneath the floor of the Rutland Golf Club, mere miles from where Richard Evans had been renovating the couple's holiday bungalow during the week of her disappearance. The brothers explained that they had been tipped off by an anonymous source about the possible burial location. Acting on this information, they had hired specialized equipment, including a camera designed to examine spaces beneath floorboards. According to their account, the footage they captured showed what appeared to be human remains in the exact location their source had indicated. They brought this evidence to North Wales Police, expecting immediate action. The police response was measured and ultimately disappointing to the Sutton brothers. Officers did conduct searches at the golf club, but according to official reports, no evidence of human remains was found. North Wales Police referred themselves to the Independent Office for Police Conduct following complaints about their handling of the search, but the investigation was referred back to the police force itself, and the complaint was ultimately rejected. The Suttons maintained their conviction that something had been found and subsequently removed before the official police search, creating a controversy that added another layer of mystery to an already deeply mysterious case. The aftermath of the Sutton brothers' claims produced an unsettling development. Mysterious metal plaques began appearing in the area, attached to benches in remote locations. The first, placed on a bench along the Prestatyn to Surth walkway, bore an inscription that read, "In memory of Trevelyan Evans. Vanished June 16, 1990. Found in Rutland Golf Club March 14, 2019. Removed March 19, 2019. The plaque was eventually removed by Denbighshire County Council, but not before it had been photographed and its message circulated widely. A second plaque appeared in 2022, this one at Pantwy Fatchwen, the remains of a 200-year-old miner's cottage on a hillside above Prestatyn. Its message was even more cryptic and accusatory. Justice awaits those responsible for the removal and disposal of Trevelyan Evans, in this life or next, from Rutland Golf Club on March 19, 2019 at noon. The appearance of these plaques suggested someone with detailed knowledge of the case was making public accusations, but the identity of whoever was creating and placing them remained unknown. The Sutton brothers reported experiencing harassment following their public claims. A window in Andy's house was smashed. Lee received threatening phone calls. Both believed that their investigation had made someone deeply uncomfortable, that they had gotten close to truth that certain parties wanted to remain hidden. The plaques seemed to support this theory, suggesting a hidden narrative involving conspiracy and cover-up that existed beneath the official investigation. Around the same time, renewed attention focused on Christopher Halliwell, a convicted double murderer serving a whole life sentence for the killings of Sion O'Callaghan and Becky Godden-Edwards. Halliwell, a former taxi driver and construction worker, had been linked to multiple unsolved disappearances and murders throughout England. In 2021, investigative journalists and retired police officers began examining whether Hallowell might have been in North Wales during June 1990. The circumstantial connections were intriguing. Hallowell had worked in the region fitting windows during the relevant time period. A witness came forward claiming to have seen a tall man with distinctive large eyes acting strangely on Market Street in Llangollen on the day of Trevelyan's disappearance, a description that matched Hallowell's appearance. The witness described seeing this man struggling with what appeared to be a rolled carpet near a vehicle, a detail that took on sinister significance when considered as a possible method of body disposal. In 2023, the Channel 4 documentary series In the Footsteps of Killers featured Trevelyan's case, with actress Emilia Fox and criminologist Professor David Wilson investigating the possible Hallowell connection. Professor Wilson noted that Hallowell was exceptionally skilled at concealing bodies, having buried victims in locations so remote and well hidden that they remained undiscovered for years. The documentary crew visited the Horseshoe Pass overlooking Llangollen, a dramatic viewpoint that offered commanding views of the surrounding countryside. Wilson suggested that if Hallowell had been responsible, he might have scouted potential burial sites from exactly such vantage points. The documentary presented what it characterized as a plausible hypothesis, that Hallowell, working in the area and possibly driving a work van, had encountered Trevelyan and lured her with a pretext involving antiques, perhaps claiming to have items she might want to purchase or asking her to evaluate something in his vehicle. Once she was in his control, he could have killed her and transported her body to a pre-selected burial location in the remote hills surrounding the town. The theory was compelling, supported by Hallowell's known patterns of behavior and geographic proximity to the crime, but it remained unproven. Steve Fulcher, the former detective superintendent who had originally investigated Hallowell and brought him to justice, publicly stated that he believed the connection deserved serious examination. North Wales police responded diplomatically, noting that they were carefully reviewing the potential link but declined to provide specifics out of respect for the Evans family's wishes. As of late 2024, no definitive connection has been established between Hallowell and Trevelyan's disappearance, leaving it as another compelling but ultimately unproven theory. The accumulation of these recent developments transformed the Trevelyan-Evans case from a dormant cold case into something actively unsettling. The mysterious plaques suggested someone with inside knowledge was making accusations. The Sutton brothers' claims, whether accurate or not, raised questions about what might be hidden. The Hallowell connection offered a potential explanation that fit known patterns of serial offending. Each thread was individually weak, but together they created a tapestry of conspiracy and hidden truth that was deeply disquieting. For Leonard Davies, now in his 80s and the last surviving member of Trevelyan's immediate family, these developments brought mixed emotions. The renewed attention meant his sister's case hadn't been forgotten, that investigators and journalists were still working to find answers. But each promising lead that ultimately produced nothing deepened the frustration and prolonged the grief. He has consistently maintained hope that before his own death, he might finally learn what happened to his sister, might be able to lay her memory to rest with some measure of certainty. The case continues to fascinate true crime enthusiasts, amateur detectives, and professional investigators alike. Podcasts have devoted episodes to analyzing the evidence. Online forums debate theories. YouTube channels present detailed timelines and speculative reconstructions. The internet age has democratized investigation in ways that simply weren't possible in 1990, allowing thousands of people to examine the case details and propose their own explanations. Some of these amateur theories have been credible enough to be forwarded to police for evaluation. What makes the Trevelyan-Evans case so persistently compelling is its fundamental impossibility. In an age of surveillance cameras, cell phone tracking, and digital footprints, it's difficult to imagine someone vanishing so completely. But in 1990, in a small Welsh town, it was apparently possible for a woman to walk out of her shop and disappear so thoroughly that decades of investigation, thousands of hours of police work, and millions of pounds in resources would fail to produce a single piece of physical evidence explaining what happened to her. The case forces confrontation with uncomfortable truths about the limits of investigation, the fragility of justice, and the ease with which someone can be erased if the circumstances align correctly. It demonstrates that even in a populated area, with witnesses present, With immediate police response, a determined perpetrator can commit a crime so cleanly that no trail remains. This is the nightmare scenario that haunts both law enforcement and the general public. The perfect crime, the unsolvable mystery, the question that will never be answered. As of December 2024, the Trevelyan Evans investigation remains officially open but inactive. North Wales police have stated that they welcome any new information, any witness who might have information they haven't previously shared, any detail that might finally illuminate what happened during those mysterious hours on June 16, 1990. The file sits in their archives, thousands of pages thick, a monument to effort and frustration, containing everything known about the case and nothing that answers its central question. The shop that was Attic Antiques has long since been converted to residential use, its connection to the mystery marked only by the memories of older residents who can point to it and tell the story of the woman who put up a sign promising to return in 2 minutes. The streets where Trevelyan walked on her final day remain much as they were, stone and history and tourist crowds, the scene of an unsolved crime invisible to those who don't know to look for it. Somewhere, the truth exists. Someone knows what happened. Whether that knowledge resides in the mind of a perpetrator who has never been identified, or in the fractured memory of a witness who saw something crucial without recognizing its significance, or buried in evidence that hasn't yet been properly interpreted, the answer is out there, waiting to be discovered. The question is whether it will be found in time, whether justice delayed for 34 years and counting can still be justice at all, whether Trevelyan Evans will remain forever the woman who promised to be back in 2 minutes and never returned. The case stands as a reminder that some mysteries persist not because they're unsolvable, but because the right piece of information hasn't yet surfaced, the right connection hasn't yet been made, the right pressure hasn't yet been applied to whoever holds the key. It represents both the worst failure of investigation and the perpetual possibility of breakthrough, a case that could theoretically be solved tomorrow if the right person came forward, if the right piece of evidence was discovered, if the right connection was finally made. For now, Trevelyan Evans remains among the vanished, her fate unknown, her story unfinished, her disappearance a wound in the fabric of a small Welsh town that has never quite healed. The note she left on her shop door that Saturday morning in June 1990 remains the most haunting artifact of the case. A promise made and forever broken, 2 minutes that stretched into eternity, a message from a threshold that became a one-way passage into darkness. And somewhere, in the hills of North Wales or buried in evidence boxes or locked in someone's conscience, the truth waits, patient and silent, for the moment when it will finally be brought into the light. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe, so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now, let's get into our final story. Story 4. The Execution Chamber's Longest Wait. Some men become monsters in an instant. Others perfect the art over decades. Thomas Eugene Creech has been on death row for 49 years, longer than most serial killers have been alive. The state of Idaho has tried to kill Thomas Eugene Creech 5 times. 5 execution dates, 5 stays, 5 moments where the needle came close to piercing flesh. But here's what keeps corrections officers awake at night. Creech isn't afraid of dying. He's been practicing for it since 1974, when he first entered death row at age 23. Now 73, he holds a record nobody wants, America's longest-serving death row inmate. The question isn't whether he deserves to die. The question is what kind of man survives half a century in a concrete box, knowing each sunrise might be his last, and still finds reasons to smile. The high desert of eastern Oregon doesn't forgive mistakes. In 1974, its vastness swallowed secrets the way it swallowed water, completely without mercy. When 2 men vanished along a desolate stretch of highway, locals assumed they'd simply taken a wrong turn, run out of gas, become another cautionary tale about respecting the wilderness. They were half right. The men had encountered something far more dangerous than nature. Thomas Creech was 22 years old, traveling with his brother, when they picked up two hitchhikers outside Burns, Oregon. William Dean and John Wayne Bradford thought they'd caught lucky rides. They'd been drifting, as young men did in the 70s, chasing work and adventure across state lines. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that they'd just climbed into a vehicle with someone who'd been fantasizing about murder since childhood. The details of what happened next would take years to piece together. Creech wasn't talkative during his initial arrests. But eventually, in the way that certain killers develop a need to be understood, he began sharing his story. Dean and Bradford were shot, their bodies dumped in different locations across the Oregon high desert. Creech described the killings with the emotional investment most people reserve for describing their morning coffee. Flat, procedural, forgettable. But these weren't his first victims. They weren't even close. Creech had been raised in a household where violence simmered just beneath everyday conversation. His father drank heavily, his fists following whatever bottles he emptied. Young Thomas learned early that the world divided into two categories: those who inflicted pain and those who received it. He decided which side he wanted to be on before he hit puberty. By his teens, Creech was setting fires, torturing animals, displaying the trinity of warning signs that criminal psychologists now recognize as predictors of serial violence. But in the rural communities where he grew up, these behaviors got dismissed as boys being boys, as roughness that time and hard work would smooth away. Nobody intervened. Nobody saw the pattern forming, the way small cruelties were teaching him larger ones. His first confirmed kill happened in 1972, when he was barely 20. A man named Edward Thomas Arnold made the fatal mistake of befriending Creech in Tucson, Arizona. Arnold was a drifter, someone without deep roots or people who'd immediately notice his absence. Perfect prey. Creech shot him, took his wallet, and kept driving. The body wasn't discovered for weeks. When it was, the desert heat had destroyed most forensic evidence. There were no witnesses, no clear motive, no obvious connection to Creech. He'd gotten away with it. That realization was intoxicating. What followed was a murder spree that would eventually span at least 5 states: Arizona, California, Oregon, Nevada, and Idaho. The exact number of victims remains unknown because Creech himself seems uncertain. He's confessed to 11 murders, but investigators believe the true count sits higher. Bodies weren't always found. Some cases that might be connected to him remain officially unsolved, their evidence boxes gathering dust in county sheriff's offices across the West. The pattern was consistent. Creech targeted vulnerable people: drifters, hitchhikers, sex workers, anyone whose disappearance wouldn't immediately trigger massive manhunts. He used various methods: shooting, beating, strangling, whatever circumstances allowed. There was no signature beyond the victim selection itself. No elaborate staging, no messages left at scenes, no attempt to communicate with authorities or media. This wasn't about fame or infamy. This was about the act itself, the moment when another person's existence ended because Thomas Creech decided it should. By 1974, he was traveling with his brother-in-law, moving constantly, staying in cheap motels or sleeping in their vehicle. The mobility served multiple purposes. It made tracking patterns nearly impossible. It provided endless opportunities to encounter isolated victims. And it fed whatever restless hunger drove Creech forward, the need for constant stimulation that many serial offenders describe. Then came the killings that would finally stop him. Not because they were more brutal than the others, but because they happened in circumstances that left evidence behind. After disposing of Dean and Bradford in Oregon, Creech crossed into Idaho. In Boise, he encountered a maintenance man named David Dale Jensen. What exactly happened between them remains disputed, but the outcome was clear. Jensen ended up dead, his body discovered in a building where Creech had been seen earlier. This time, there were witnesses who could place him at the scene. There was physical evidence connecting him to the crime. The walls that had protected him were finally crumbling. When police arrested Creech in October 1974, they had no idea what they'd actually caught. They were investigating one murder. What they discovered was a predator who'd been killing across the western United States for years, leaving a trail of bodies that law enforcement agencies hadn't even realized belonged to a single perpetrator. During interrogation, Creech displayed what investigators would later describe as unsettling calmness. He wasn't defiant or aggressive. He answered questions politely, sometimes helpfully. He confessed to multiple murders with the same tone someone might use to list items on a grocery receipt. There was no remorse, no attempts to minimize or justify, just facts delivered flatly about taking human lives. The prosecution in Idaho moved quickly. They had solid evidence for the Jensen murder, and that was enough for a death sentence. Creech was convicted in 1975 and sentenced to die. He was 23 years old, still young enough that many of his high school classmates were just finishing college, starting careers, getting married. His classmates were building lives. He'd spent his early 20s ending them. Death row in the Idaho Maximum Security Institution became Creech's new address. The state promised his execution would come swiftly, that justice would be served before the decade ended. They were wrong. What began instead was a legal and bureaucratic odyssey that would stretch across 5 decades, making Creech a dark record holder, the man death row couldn't kill. Maximum security death row operates on its own timeline, its own rules, its own strange logic. The cells are small, typically 6 feet by 9 feet, about the size of a parking space. Inmates spend 23 hours a day inside them. 1 hour for recreation, usually alone in a small outdoor cage. Meals delivered through slots. Human contact minimized. Silence enforced. The architecture is designed to break spirits, to make men beg for the execution they supposedly feared. Thomas Creech didn't break. He adapted. While other death row inmates deteriorated, losing sanity, developing severe mental illnesses, aging rapidly under the stress, Creech maintained an eerie stability. He read voraciously, everything from westerns to philosophy. He exercised in his cell, maintaining physical health despite the constraints. He followed current events, keeping track of the outside world that continued without him. Guards noted that he was polite, cooperative, never causing disciplinary problems. This cooperation had limits, though, deadly limits. In 1981, Creech had been on death row for 6 years when he encountered another inmate during a rare moment of proximity. David Dale Jensen, no relation to the victim Creech had been convicted of killing, was a fellow death row inmate, someone facing execution for his own crimes. The two men had some kind of dispute. The details remain murky, shrouded in the secrecy that governs prison hierarchies and conflicts. What isn't murky is what happened next. Creech beat Jensen to death with a battery wrapped in a sock, creating an improvised weapon that pulverized the man's skull. Guards found Jensen's body in a recreation area, brain matter leaking onto concrete, Creech standing nearby, blood on his hands, that same flat expression he'd worn during his original murder confessions. He'd killed again, on death row, while waiting to be executed for previous murders. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on Idaho officials. How do you punish a man who's already sentenced to die? What additional deterrent exists? They tried anyway, charging him with Jensen's murder, convicting him, adding another death sentence to the one he already had. Changed nothing. Creech remained in the same cell, living the same routine, reading the same books, waiting for an execution that never seemed to arrive. This is where the story becomes a study in the American death penalty's contradictions. By the 1980s, legal challenges were clogging the execution pipeline. Appeals courts were reviewing procedures, questioning methods, ordering stays. The Supreme Court had briefly halted all executions in the 1970s with its Furman v. Georgia decision, then allowed them to resume with Gregg v. Georgia, but under stricter guidelines. States were struggling to develop execution protocols that could survive judicial scrutiny. Idaho set multiple execution dates for Creech throughout the 80s and 90s. Each time, courts intervened. His lawyers assigned public defenders, then later advocacy groups opposed to capital punishment, filed motion after motion, appeal after appeal. They weren't arguing his innocence. The evidence was overwhelming, his confessions clear. Instead, they challenged procedures, questioned whether Idaho's execution methods constituted cruel and unusual punishment, raised concerns about jury selection in his trials, explored every possible avenue for delay. And the delays worked. Year after year, execution dates came and went. Creech remained alive, aging in his cell, watching younger inmates arrive on death row and sometimes leave it. Through execution, through successful appeals, through natural death. He witnessed the evolution of execution methods. Hanging gave way to firing squad to lethal injection. Each change brought new legal challenges, new questions, new delays. And through it all, Creech endured, adapting to each shift in his environment with the same disturbing calmness that had characterized his killing spree. By the 2000s, something strange was happening. Creech had been on death row longer than most of his victims had been alive. He'd entered at 23. By 50, he'd spent more than half his existence waiting to die. The young man who'd killed impulsively, driven by urges he later described as uncontrollable, was now elderly by prison standards, his hair white, his body showing signs of age despite his exercise regimen. Journalists occasionally wrote about him, fascinated by this record nobody wanted. He gave interviews sometimes, speaking about his crimes with what seemed like genuine remorse. Though psychologists warned that serial killers often learn to mimic appropriate emotions without actually feeling them. He claimed to have found religion, to have been born again, to regret the suffering he'd caused. Whether this was genuine transformation or practice performance remained debatable. What wasn't debatable was the sheer oddity of his situation. The American death penalty system, designed to deliver finality, had instead created a bizarre form of indefinite detention. Creech was serving a death sentence that functioned more like life without parole, an execution order that had become theoretical rather than imminent. Prison officials didn't know what to make of him. He was a model inmate by conventional metrics, following rules, avoiding conflicts with other prisoners, cooperating with guards. But he'd also demonstrated, unequivocally, that he was willing to kill even under maximum security conditions, even knowing he was already condemned to die. How do you manage someone who represents no threat to institutional order, but has proven himself capable of lethal violence regardless of consequences? The answer, apparently, was to keep him locked down, keep him isolated, and keep hoping the courts would finally allow his execution to proceed. Idaho's Department of Corrections spent millions housing him over the decades. Security measures designed for the most dangerous offenders. Medical care as he aged. Legal costs defending the state's right to execute him against endless appeals. Critics of capital punishment pointed to Creech as evidence of the system's dysfunction. He'd become a symbol of how the death penalty, in practice, often delivers neither justice nor closure, but instead creates an expensive, lengthy, morally ambiguous limbo. Supporters of capital punishment pointed to the same case as evidence that appeals had become too easy, too numerous, that procedural safeguards had metastasized into obstacles preventing legitimate sentences from being carried out. Both sides were arguing about Creech while Creech himself kept living his strange half-life, not quite dead but barely alive, existing in a concrete cage where time moved differently, where decades compressed into routine and routine stretched each day into something resembling infinity. February 2024. Thomas Eugene Creech is 73 years old. He's been on death row for 49 years, longer than some guards at the prison have been alive. And finally, after all the delays, all the appeals, all the stays, Idaho is ready to execute him. Except they can't find a vein. The execution chamber at the Idaho Maximum Security Institution is a small room, clinically sterile, designed to make killing seem medical rather than punitive. There's a gurney, restraints, for lines, monitoring equipment. The lethal injection protocol calls for a series of drugs. A sedative to render the prisoner unconscious, a paralytic to stop breathing, and finally potassium chloride to stop the heart. When it works properly, the process takes minutes. The prisoner drifts off to sleep and never wakes. Clean, humane, or so the theory goes. But Creech's body has spent decades in a cell with minimal movement. His veins, like those of many elderly inmates, have become fragile, difficult to access. The medical team, a term used loosely as most licensed physicians refuse to participate in executions, attempts to establish 4 lines in his arms. They fail. They try his hands. Fail again. They check his legs, his feet, searching for viable access points. For nearly an hour, they stick Creech with needles, probing for veins that can sustain the equipment necessary to pump poison into his bloodstream. He lies on the gurney, conscious, aware, watching the ceiling while strangers jab his deteriorating body. Witnesses in the viewing room watch the clock, increasingly uncomfortable. This isn't how executions are supposed to proceed. There's supposed to be dignity, however perverse that concept becomes when applied to state-sanctioned killing. Finally, officials make a decision. They're calling it off. Not permanently, they'll reschedule, try again another day. But today, the execution cannot proceed. The machinery of death has failed on the most basic technical level. Creech is unstrapped from the gurney and escorted back to his cell. He's been 8 steps from death, lying on the execution table, and now he's being returned to the holding area where condemned inmates spend their final days. It's a resurrection of sorts, though nobody uses that word. The state promises to try again, to set a new date, to complete what they started. But the botched attempt raises troubling questions that extend far beyond Thomas Creech himself. If the state can't execute a man efficiently even after 5 decades of preparation, what does that say about capital punishment's practical viability? And more darkly, is it cruel and unusual punishment to repeatedly bring someone to the edge of death, only to pull back, then promise to try again? Creech's lawyers immediately file new appeals, arguing that the failed execution attempt violated his constitutional rights. They cite the 8th Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment, pointing to the hour-long ordeal as evidence of systematic problems with Idaho's execution protocol. They note that Creech is elderly, that his veins are compromised, that further attempts will likely face the same challenges. The state counters that technical difficulties don't constitute constitutional violations. They argue that Creech deserves to die for his crimes, that his victims didn't receive the mercy of failed executions and delayed justice. They promise to develop new procedures, to bring in more experienced medical personnel, to ensure the next attempt succeeds. Meanwhile, Creech returns to the routine he's maintained for nearly 5 decades: reading, exercising, following current events, waiting. He's been expecting death since 1975. The botched execution is just another delay in a life defined by waiting for endings that never quite arrive. Other death row inmates watch the situation with mixed reactions. Some feel sympathy. Whatever Creech's crimes, the botched execution was undeniably disturbing. Others see it as deserved suffering, cosmic justice for a serial killer experiencing fear and helplessness his victims once felt. Guards are rattled. The execution was supposed to provide closure, a sense that justice eventually prevails. Instead, it demonstrated system failure, raising doubts about competence and procedures. Months pass. Idaho officials work on new protocols, studying Creech's medical records, consulting with prison systems in other states that have successfully executed elderly inmates. They consider alternatives, using a central line, which requires surgical insertion into a major vein near the heart, using alternative sites like the femoral vein in the groin, even exploring whether Idaho should revert to firing squad, an older method that doesn't depend on vein accessibility. Each option brings its own complications. Central lines require medical expertise that prison staff may not possess. Alternative sites are more painful to access and carry higher risks of complications. Firing squad, while efficient, faces public relations problems. It's seen as barbaric, medieval, out of step with modern sensibilities about execution. The delays continue. Creech's execution date gets pushed back, again and again, as officials grapple with logistical challenges. Anti-death penalty activists seize on the case as evidence that capital punishment has become unworkable, that states are struggling to kill prisoners even when courts have authorized executions. Pro-death penalty advocates grow frustrated, arguing that a serial killer is being allowed to live indefinitely because of bureaucratic incompetence. Creech himself offers few public comments. In brief statements through his lawyers, he expresses willingness to die, claims he's made peace with his fate, suggests that the prolonged uncertainty is its own form of torture. Whether these statements reflect genuine feelings or strategic positioning remains unclear. What's certain is that the machinery designed to end his life has failed repeatedly. Not because of legal challenges, not because of constitutional questions, but because his 73-year-old body won't cooperate with execution protocols developed for younger, healthier prisoners. And so the wait continues. The longest-serving death row inmate in American history keeps waiting, guards keep watching, and Idaho keeps promising that next time, finally, they'll complete what they've been trying to do since 1975. There are photographs of Thomas Eugene Creech from different decades, visual markers of time's passage in a life suspended between living and dying. In the 1975 mugshots, he's young, almost boyish, with dark hair and the kind of generic features that would let him blend into any crowd. By the 90s, gray has crept into his temples. Lines have etched around his eyes. Recent images show an elderly man, white-haired and worn, someone who could be any grandfather except for the orange jumpsuit and prison identification number. But what the photographs can't capture is what nearly 5 decades on death row does to a human mind. The psychological impact of waiting to die, day after day, year after year, knowing your life will end on a schedule determined by others but never knowing exactly when. Researchers who study death row conditions describe a phenomenon called death row syndrome, severe mental deterioration caused by prolonged solitary confinement combined with execution anxiety. Symptoms include paranoia, hallucinations, cognitive decline, and emotional numbing. Many inmates develop these symptoms within years of arriving on death row. Creech has endured conditions designed to break human beings for nearly half a century. Yet by all accounts, he remains relatively stable. Perhaps his earlier killings immunized him somehow, prepared him psychologically for sustained isolation. Or perhaps he's deteriorating internally in ways that superficial evaluations miss. Guards report that he's cooperative, but cooperation can be a mask, learned behavior that conceals rather than reveals inner states. His victims' families have watched this extended timeline with understandable anguish. Justice they were promised would be swift. Instead, they've spent decades waiting alongside Creech, aging as he ages, watching years disappear into legal proceedings and bureaucratic delays. Some family members have died themselves, never seeing the execution they were promised. Others have reached a point of exhaustion, where even the prospect of Creech's death brings little comfort because it's been so long since their loved ones died that revenge no longer provides meaningful closure. This is perhaps the death penalty's cruelest irony. In trying to deliver ultimate punishment, the system sometimes creates suffering that extends far beyond the condemned prisoner. Families of victims remain tethered to their trauma, unable to move forward while execution dates keep getting rescheduled. Guards and prison staff live with the knowledge that they're maintaining a man specifically so he can eventually be killed. Taxpayers fund the enormous costs of death row detention, estimated at millions of dollars per inmate over decades, without seeing clear outcomes. And then there's the question that haunts everyone involved. What purpose does Creech's execution serve now? He's 73. He's been imprisoned for 50 years. Even if released tomorrow, he'd pose minimal threat. An elderly man whose killing spree ended when Richard Nixon was president. The person who committed those murders in the early 70s is, in some sense, already dead, replaced by an aged prisoner who spent more time waiting for punishment than he spent free. But law doesn't recognize this distinction. The sentence was death, and death it must be, regardless of how much time has passed or how circumstances have changed. The machinery of justice, once set in motion, lacks mechanisms for reconsideration based on temporal decay. Creech's crimes were heinous enough to warrant execution. Therefore, execute him, even if doing so requires extraordinary efforts and decades of delay. Idaho officials scheduled another execution attempt for 2024, then 2025. Each time, new complications arose. Creech's veins continued deteriorating. Questions about protocol persisted. Legal challenges multiplied. The state remained committed to completing the execution, but commitment alone couldn't overcome practical obstacles. Meanwhile, the debate about capital punishment itself evolved around Creech's case. Supporters argued that his longevity on death row proved the system was broken, that appeals had become too easy, that execution should follow conviction far more quickly. Opponents argued that his longevity proved the system was broken, that capital punishment inflicted excessive suffering, that it failed to deliver the swift justice it promised. Both sides agreed the situation was broken. They disagreed about solutions. Creech's attorneys continued filing appeals, though the grounds had become increasingly narrow after decades of litigation. They challenged execution methods, questioned whether age and medical conditions made him unsuitable for lethal injection, raised issues about competency given potential cognitive decline. Each appeal bought time, extended the wait, pushed death a little further into the future. And Creech kept living his strange half-life. Reading books in his cell, eating meals delivered through slots, exercising in his tiny space, following news about the outside world, a world that had transformed completely since his arrest. In 1974, there were no personal computers, no internet, no cell phones. The culture, politics, technology, everything had changed. But Creech's routine remained essentially unchanged. Wake, eat, exercise, read, sleep, repeat, always with the knowledge that any day might bring news of a new execution date. There's a philosophical question embedded in his existence. At what point does a death sentence become something else entirely? When does punishment for past crimes transform into a form of torture in its own right? The framers of the Constitution prohibited cruel and unusual punishment, but they lived in an era when executions happened swiftly, when condemned prisoners didn't languish for decades. They couldn't have imagined someone spending half a century waiting to die, aging into elderhood in a concrete box, repeatedly brought to the edge of execution only to be pulled back. The state of Idaho has exhausted considerable resources trying to execute one man. Millions in housing costs, legal expenses defending the sentence against appeals, medical evaluation costs, administrative overhead. All to complete an execution ordered in 1975, when Gerald Ford was president and disco-dominated pop music. Was it worth it? The families of Creech's victims deserve justice, certainly. But does justice require execution, or has his confinement already served that purpose? And if execution remains necessary, why has it taken 5 decades to complete? These questions don't have easy answers. They exist in the space where law, morality, practicality, and emotion intersect, creating dilemmas that resist simple resolution. Thomas Eugene Creech remains on death row as of this writing. Idaho continues promising that execution will proceed, that technical problems will be resolved, that justice will eventually be served. Creech continues waiting, as he's waited since disco gave way to new wave to grunge, grunge to whatever comes next. He's become a strange fixture, a man who exists primarily as a symbol of death penalty's complexities rather than as an individual human being. His victims remain dead, their families remain wounded, and the machinery of justice keeps grinding forward, slowly, imperfectly, toward an ending that's been promised for 49 years but never quite arrives. Some nights, guards walk past Creech's cell and wonder what he thinks about. Whether he dreams of the people he killed. Whether he feels remorse or simply emptiness. Whether he wants death to finally come or fears it despite his claims of acceptance. The guards don't ask. Creech doesn't volunteer. The questions hang in the air, unanswered, like everything else in this long, strange wait. And the clock keeps ticking. Another day on death row. Another day closer to an execution that may or may not happen. Another day in the longest wait in American criminal justice history. Some men become monsters in an instant. Others perfect the art over decades. But all of them eventually must face time, and time, it turns out, is more patient than any state, any system, any promise of justice. Time just waits, indifferent, watching monsters and victims and guards and lawyers all age together, all waiting for endings that seem simultaneously inevitable and impossibly distant. Thank you for watching and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.